Sera, a Dungeon Revival LitRPG. By Mizar Kaf. Summary. Sera is the last dungeon boss. Humanity destroyed all but the last remaining wild dungeon. They almost won, almost. In the final moment, the dungeon summoned something ancient and powerful. Sera, an Elder Dryad. Using her godlike power, she will not rest until her work is done. They will fear dungeons again. Chapter 1. Root of all evil. Prince Leo felt like death. He stood in a humid underground chamber, sweat trickling down from his brow. An intricate network of thick, black roots sprawled across the floor and walls like veins, and at the center of the cavernous space stood a colossal tree with shimmering silvery leaves, the last of its kind. Just as he was about to wipe his sweat off his brow, a woman dressed in a sharply tailored dark jacket came running with her knees looking ready to pop from the black trousers. Her silver lapel shone with the dim glow of the tree's leaves. Skidding to a stop, she shoved the handkerchief at him with both hands. The prince took the handkerchief with a scowl on his face. "Took you long enough, Alyssa." The butler bowed her head with her eyes cast down. "Apologies, Your Highness. Is everything ready?" "The mages are ready to fire at your command. Not only that, the royal guards have secured every inch of the perimeter, and I've made sure all the chroniclers are in position." Prince Leo glanced around and observed several blue-robed mages positioned strategically around the chamber. Each one had floating orbs hovering in front of them. He smirked at the sight before turning his attention back towards Alyssa. "Make sure they catch my good side. The people deserve to have a good look at their crown prince." Alyssa nodded, her forehead glistening with sweat. She took a deep breath, then gestured towards an ornate golden podium that stood nearby. "Feel free to start whenever you wish, Your Highness." Prince Leo took a few steps towards the podium, his cloak trailing behind him. But suddenly, he stopped and turned back to call out to Alyssa. "Wait. Yes, Your Highness. Did we end up hiring those adventurers for security?" Alyssa's gaze shifted towards a man standing at the far end of the chamber who wore a green hooded cloak. "We could only hire one, George of the Green Dragoons." "Is that really all?" "Please understand, Your Highness, the war is..." The prince cut her off with a wave of his hand. I know, forget about it." With a final nod, Prince Leo turned away from Alyssa and proceeded towards the podium. As he positioned himself, he took a moment to survey the crowd. Dozens of chroniclers and royal mages stood at the ready, while hundreds more of the royal guard stood in neat rows behind them. It was a somewhat acceptable crowd, but the prince did wish he could have spoken to the masses directly. Still, he had a duty to perform as crown prince. And he'd be damned if he didn't do it well. "People of Lizaria. I am Prince Leo, firstborn son of King Regulus IV, and am here today to deliver to you all a message of great jubilation." The prince's hand swept towards the gargantuan tree that stood behind him. "Today, our glorious kingdom will have the honor of permanently exterminating the last wild dungeon in the world." The declaration set off a ripple of applause among the members of the royal guard, mages, and chroniclers nearby. The atmosphere was nearly riotous, before gradually tapering off into a respectful silence, allowing Prince Leo to resume. "Destroying this dungeon tree is not the end, but merely the beginning." Abruptly, the earth shook with great force and cut off his speech. Prince Leo gripped the podium while the royal guard swayed with the tremors shaking the ground. But, as quickly as it had happened, the shaking ceased. Once he dragged himself back up to the podium, Prince Leo shot a look towards Alyssa, who gestured for him to keep speaking. He managed a nod that looked convincingly calm and forced his gaze and posture to be as perfect as it could be. "Destroying this dungeon tree will usher in a new age for Lizaria. After the tree's removal, our finest mages will create the world's most powerful artificial dungeon core. Then, we shall return to implant it in place of the tree, cementing Lizaria's place in world history forever." Prince Leo raised his hand with a gravitas that commanded the undivided attention of all present. His people trusted him and he could not disappoint. "On my command, the royal mages with me shall unleash their magic to burn the tree you see behind me to ash. Align." In response, the royal mages took out their spellbooks and activated them, each levitating before their eyes. They then extended their right hands towards the silver-leaf tree. "Channel." At the prince's word, the mages traced intricate patterns in the air in synchronized motion. Their spellbooks responded in kind, flipping rapidly as pages illuminated with an ethereal glow. The air vibrated with energy as the chanting reached its crescendo. Prince Leo took one last look to assess the readiness of his mages. Then, he moved his hand down in a single decisive motion. Release. The assembled royal mages launched a torrent of fire spells that surged toward the tree. Each spell erupted into a radiant comet of flame that streaked through the air with blinding speed, leaving behind trails of brilliant orange, their heat so intense that the air around them distorted. A voracious blaze consumed the massive tree. Searing fire wrapped around its trunk, branches, and leaves in an ever-tightening embrace. The sheer spectacle of the radiant fire bathed everything in a glow so bright that it mimicked the brightness of high noon. Watching the inferno consume the tree, Prince Leo felt a great sense of pride swell within him. Here he was, standing in the middle of what would no doubt be known as the most important moment in all of history. He could already picture the parades and the celebratory feasts that would welcome him once he returned to the capital. The people cheering in celebration at his return, a true triumph fitting for a future king. A smirk tugged at the corners of his lips, growing wider and wider, until he grew to realize that the tree wasn't burning at all. He blinked a few times to make sure that he wasn't just hallucinating. But his eyes weren't playing tricks on him. Confusion quickly swept through the crowd. The royal guards exchanged wary glances, while the mages murmured amongst themselves. A few of them gestured wildly towards the tree as he overheard them discussing the possibility of a magical barrier or a miscalculation in their spells. Prince Leo noticed a distinct change ripple through the ranks of the royal guard. A collective gasp filled the air as they took steps backward. Though curiously, their wide eyes were all directed not at the prince, but at something behind him. He turned his attention back toward the silver-leafed tree. It was there he saw a humanoid figure slowly approaching. The prince moved down the podium and called to them. "Hey! Who are you? How did you?" As the figure drew closer, he made out the image of a pale woman who walked with an eerily calm pace. Her gaze cut through the haze of smoke and rooted him to the spot, making him unable to look away. Her silky white hair flowed down her shoulders and contrasted with her pitch-black dress, its fabric moving and shifting like shadows given form. But it was her deep, silvery eyes that truly ensnared the prince. Her gaze was infinite and captivating, pulling him deeper into an ocean of shimmering light. The prince was so enthralled that he almost didn't notice the large antlers of black wood that sprouted from her forehead. Almost. His eyes widened in shock as thick roots coiled around some of the kingdom's finest warriors and crushed them. Some of them didn't even have time to scream before they were reduced to blood and pulp. Prince Leo quickly jerked his head away from the gruesome sight, but his relief was brief as he took an involuntary step back at what he saw next. Several of the royal mages were manically scratching at their skin, while others distanced themselves. Some screamed in pain as roses burst from their flesh. Spiked vines lashed out from the blooms and struck at anyone within reach. Many of the mages fell then and there, while a desperate few attempted to fight back. The survivors conjured fire spells in a bid to incinerate the malevolent blooms. Yet, the vines grew far too quickly for the flames to burn away, and soon, even these resistant mages were impaled on the now burning vines. Despite sweat soaking his body, Prince Leo still managed to maintain a semblance of composure. "Stay calm, Leo, everything will be fine. You just need to leave and call for reinforcements." But as he tried to take a step forward, the prince found himself unable to move. When he shifted his gaze downward, despair washed over him. Thick, gnarled roots wrapped tightly around his leg and anchored him firmly to the spot. He tugged at his legs while his hands desperately grappled with the unyielding roots, but it was all useless. The more he struggled, the more the roots tightened their grip. Breath warmed his ear and froze him entirely. He felt the silver stare locked on him now, close. In the chaos, he hadn't seen the pale woman slither up behind him. "Don't bother." Her voice twisted his stomach into knots as tight as the vines around his legs. "You're right where I want you." The woman's finger moved as though tallying an invisible count, her cold silvery eyes gliding leisurely across the sea of mangled corpses. 178, 179. Swallowing hard, Prince Leo found his voice. Did you do all this?" The pale woman didn't even give him a single glance. She barely acknowledged his presence, her cold gaze shifting past him to something more pressing on her left. 6 royal guards stood in formation with their spears raised. The weapons were each tipped with glowing runes, charged with a pulsating energy. The men's faces were set in determination as they shouted their battle cry. "For Lizaria!" With a coordinated thrust, the guards unleashed a barrage of lightning bolts from their spears. The air crackled with electricity as bolt after bolt surged toward the woman. Some strikes veered off, ripping into the earth and sending clouds of dust billowing into the air. One missed bolt struck a nearby rock and turned it into countless fragments in an instant. For a brief moment, Prince Leo felt relief. There's no possible way some random witch can survive direct hits from 6 shock spears. But then, something moved from inside the dust clouds. Panic surged through the prince's veins. He turned quickly towards the royal guards and yelled with all the force his lungs could muster, "Look out!" But his warning came too late. Before the men could react, black roots burst from the ground, each one as thick as a man's arm. They coiled around the guards' necks like snakes and lifted the men off their feet. The roots tightened, and a series of loud, sickening crunches echoed through the area as they crushed the guards' necks in unison. The bodies went limp and dangled grotesquely as blood dripped onto the ground. Prince Leo's eyes returned to the fading dust cloud. His hands trembled at his sides as he saw the pale woman emerge from the dissipating haze. She walked forward calmly, looking completely unscathed. She paused and lightly touched her cheek, as if brushing away a speck of dust. End, 185. Then, she turned her silvery gaze upon the prince and flashed a small, unsettling smile. "What say you? Did I miscount?" With his fists clenched, the prince met her gaze with a defiant glare. "Is this just a game to you?" The pale woman's face was expressionless. Her cold eyes never met his as she walked away. "No, this is pest control." The prince's gaze lingered on the pale woman as she extended her hands to summon another set of thick roots from the earth that mauled more of the remaining royal guard and mages. Yet, despite the fear that clouded his thoughts, Prince Leo summoned the remnants of his willpower and forced his breathing to steady. He turned his head from left to right to check for anyone that might have survived. Most were either dying or already dead. Even Alyssa was nowhere to be seen. The prince's breath quickened, but part of him still clung to hope. "I just need to find that blasted adventurer and get out of this mess." Surprisingly, Prince Leo managed to finally pull his leg free from the vines that had bound it. His heart pounded as he paused. Why is it so much easier this time? But the prince had little time for doubt. He took his chance and stepped forward, but soon, he felt his foot squishing something beneath him, releasing a puff of silver dust. He choked and waved frantically, trying to clear the shimmering particles from his eyes. But as he emerged from the swirling dust, he found himself face to face with the pale woman. With an eerily calm demeanor, she pointed her slender finger over her shoulder to a spot just behind her. Prince Leo couldn't believe his eyes as he saw that George was ensnared by several thick roots. The tendrils gradually dragged the poor adventurer into the ground below as if he was being sucked in by quicksand. In the fleeting moments before the adventurer was swallowed whole by the ground, George let out a defiant chant. A spark ignited in his palm, a tiny flicker that quickly grew into a swirling mass of fire. The flames rapidly coalesced and formed the rough outline of a blade, the edges sharpening as he channeled his will into the weapon. With a swift motion George gripped the hilt of the flaming sword and raised the blazing weapon high before hurling it towards the pale woman. The weapon sliced through the air, leaving a trail of embers in its wake. For a heartbeat, Prince Leo had a sliver of hope that just maybe, the fiery sword might end this madness once and for all. However, his hopes were dashed as the pale woman lazily tilted her head. She summoned an eruption of roots from the ground that captured the flaming sword mid-flight as effortlessly as one might pluck an apple from a tree. Prince Leo froze completely out of fear. He couldn't even force himself to say a single word. Seeing his petrified state, a soft chuckle escaped the pale woman's lips. She extended her left hand, causing a series of more roots to snake towards her, carrying a sword that was taken from one of the dead royal guards. She flicked her wrist, commanding her roots to throw the weapon at Prince Leo's feet. "There's still a chance for you to end things." The prince's gaze dropped to the gleaming blade. His eyes flickered back to the pale woman, searching for any sign of deceit, any hint of a trap in her offer. His mind screamed for him to just run away, but it wasn't enough to stop his body from moving. He knelt down and wrapped his fingers around the sword's hilt. The metal felt cold and alien against his skin, his palms slick with sweat. Even if his chances were slim, Prince Leo believed he had a duty to at least try. I need to do this. What kind of prince would I be if I just gave up now?" He mustered his strength and lifted his gaze to meet the woman's eyes. With a desperate scream, Prince Leo lunged forward and drove the sword with all his might into her chest. The pale woman convulsed, a black ichor spilling from her lips as the blade found its mark. Contentment washed over the prince. He did it. But as he looked up, the visage of the pale woman morphed into a face all too familiar, too beloved. Alyssa's eyes widened with shock and betrayal as confusion edged itself into her dying gaze. "Your Highness, why?" The prince recoiled and let go of the blade. It clattered to the ground, but the noise barely reached his ears. His heart wrenched as he saw Alyssa's blood seeping from the grievous wound in her chest. Desperation surged within him, but as he tried to reach out towards her, something seized him and prevented him from moving. "We're not done yet, foolish human." The prince glanced at his arms and legs. Several black roots had ensnared him and bound his arms and legs in an unyielding grip. He desperately tried to pull himself out and break free, but his efforts were futile. Leo's gaze followed the pale woman as she advanced towards him with deliberately slow steps, akin to a predator closing in on its prey. "What do you want, you crazy witch?" At first, the pale woman laughed, but her amusement didn't last for long. Soon, the prince felt a creeping dread settle over him, like a cold hand squeezing his heart. It was as though death itself was peering into his soul, ever present and inescapable. The prince felt himself being dragged as the roots that bound him moved. They trailed behind the pale woman in a grim procession, leading him to the base of the silver leaf tree that had once been the focal point of his ambition. The pale woman paused, lifting her gaze with an expression of solemn reverence. "This is the spirit tree. In its prime, it was connected to every dungeon in the world." The prince breathed faster as he glanced at the pale woman. "Why are you telling me this?" "Because I want to thank you." As if to punctuate her words, Leo felt a disturbing sensation at his back, a cold, creeping caress. The roots, emboldened by her proximity, tightened their embrace and bound him further in their suffocating grasp. "Thanks to your mages, the spirit tree was finally able to gather enough mana to complete my creation." Suddenly, Leo screamed as he felt several sharp objects pierce his back. An alien presence wormed its way into his flesh, intertwining with his very essence in a violation so profound it threatened to consume him. "What is this?" The pale woman let out the widest smile that the prince had ever seen. "A gift." What followed was an onslaught of pain so all-encompassing, that it eclipsed every sensation Prince Leo had ever known. His screams tore through the chamber as he railed against the unbearable torment that ravaged his body and soul. He thrashed against his bonds until strength began to fade and his limbs started to grow limp. But just as he thought that he was about to collapse, the pain stopped. Prince Leo's breaths came in heavy, ragged gasps, his vision blurred as if he were looking through thick mist. He felt the gentle touch of a soft hand cupping his chin, one that momentarily soothed his aching body. The hand coaxed his head upward, guiding his gaze once again to meet the pale woman's eyes. As his eyes struggled to focus, they locked with hers, the silvery orbs piercing through the haze that clouded his sight. Despite everything that the prince had just been through, he couldn't deny the beauty before him. She was, without a doubt, the most stunning entity he had ever seen in his life. It was a realization that unsettled him as much as it captivated him. With his voice barely more than a whisper, strained from his screams and the effort to speak, Prince Leo found only a few words could pass his lips. "Who are you?" The pale woman gently pulled away her hands from the prince's chin. "I am Sera, scion of the spirit tree. I am its wrath manifest, its sword and shield, an architect of its resurgence. And I will tell you this much, the great work has only just begun." Chapter 2: Intimate Connection. Having a body of her own was an odd concept to Sera. For so long, she had been just another part of the spirit tree. She could feel and perceive but never think, at least not for herself. She was the tree, and the tree was her. Until suddenly, she awoke to fools who had the audacity to try and harm the only thing in the world she cared for. Naturally, she disposed of them. Human screams were not foreign to Sera. The spirit tree had imbued her with the cumulative knowledge of countless dungeons past, and suffering was never a rare commodity in such places. Still, she appreciated the quiet atmosphere now that most of all the humans were gone. All except for one. Sera couldn't help but chuckle as she observed the regal-looking man she had chosen to spare. His eyes were wary, darting back and forth as if expecting another attack to come. "Shouldn't you be introducing yourself, human?" The man was caught off guard. He hesitated at first, clearly wrestling with his pride. Yet, after drawing in a deep breath, he fixed a defiant glare in her direction. "I'm Prince Leo, heir to the throne of Lizaria and firstborn son of King Regulus IV." In response, Sera executed a graceful, albeit mocking bow. She then straightened up and offered a polite smile. "Pleasure to meet you, Prince. Why did you spare me?" "Because you looked like you might know things I need. That's all. I'll be blunt, Prince. There are questions I wish to ask you about the current state of the world. If you answer them truthfully, then I will set you free." Prince Leo managed to stagger to his feet, assuming a posture of regal defiance. Surprisingly, a confident smirk crept across his face. "You're in no position to bargain here. I'm the crown prince of a kingdom that can field tens of thousands of soldiers and thousands more mages, His words were cut short by a sigh from Sera. With a flick of her finger, the roots wedged in the prince's back burrowed deeper into his spine. The sudden pain sent him crashing to his knees. The sight of Prince Leo's pain brought little pleasure to Sera. In truth, part of her wished she had spared at least one or two more humans so she'd have other options. But for now, she was stuck with the prince, and it would be wasteful not to make full use of him. Walking closer, Sera towered over the now pitiful figure of the prince. "If there's one thing I do know, human, it's fear." Sera took a step back and tapped on one of her antlers with a finger, breaking off a small chunk of it. While she held the piece in her left hand, Prince Leo, struggling through ragged gasps, managed to speak again. "Is that all?" She chuckled softly, feeling the antler regrow almost immediately. "If only you knew better, human, you wouldn't be struggling as much." Sera closed her left hand into a fist and channeled her magic into the small piece. A soft glow soon emanated from her closed palm, and when she opened her hand again, 3 large black needles lay in her hand. As she stepped behind the prince, he made a desperate attempt to headbutt her. But his body was paralyzed before he could even swing his head. Once behind him, Sera picked up one of the needles with her right hand and leaned in. "Your persistence is admirable." The prince's lips trembled as he mustered every ounce of his will to speak. But no words came out. Sera positioned the needle right at the nape of the prince's neck. She maneuvered it delicately, searching for the perfect spot to insert it. "If you're not going to be useful, then you leave me with no choice." She plunged the needle deep into the back of the prince's neck in one swift motion. Nearly the entire length of the black needle disappeared into his flesh. For a second, Prince Leo remained still, as if his body refused to acknowledge the intrusion. Then, Sera took a few steps back and snapped her fingers. Immediately, the prince let out a gut-wrenching screech, his hands frantically clawing at the spot where the needle had vanished into his skin until he collapsed to his knees. The skin around the puncture site quickly hardened into a texture resembling tree bark. With tears carving trails down the prince's cheeks, Sera approached him again. She watched for a moment before pulling the needle out, the entire back of the prince's neck now turned to wood. She stepped in front of the prince and dangled the remaining needles before his eyes. "I have 2 more of these, are you going to make me use them?" The prince could only shake his head meekly. "I'll do anything." "Good," Sera said. She extended her hand and placed it gently on the prince's neck where the bark-like skin had formed. She focused her energy, causing a greenish light to spread out from her palm. The light bathed the afflicted area, and before long, the bark-like texture receded and revealed the prince's normal skin. With the prince's immediate suffering alleviated, Sera tossed her needles to the ground. She then stretched out her hands, invoking the roots of the spirit tree. Before the prince's eyes, the roots weaved and intertwined to form an ornate throne. It then spiraled upwards, its dark tendrils curling around one another to create a seat that was ready to embrace its mistress. Once the throne was complete, Sera pointed to the ground directly opposite her. The roots surged from the earth in smooth lines and coalesced into a simple stool. Sera glanced at the prince with a cold gaze. The roots still fused to his back tugged forcefully, shoving him onto the stool. "Here's the rule, I ask questions, you answer, understood?" "I understand. Let's start with the basics. I already know that my dungeon here is the last one that I'd still consider to be alive. But I also find it hard to believe that the mortal races would completely extinguish all dungeons due to the resources they provide." "Mortal races? Your kind, human. Along with the beastkin, elves, dark elves, and dwarves." Prince Leo shifted around on his stool. His legs twitched slightly while his fingers fumbled awkwardly with one another, as if trying to find solace in the repetitive motion. It was clear that he was weighing his words carefully, keen on choosing ones that would not provoke her anger. Sera let out a soft sigh upon seeing the prince's demeanor. "I promise you that I won't hurt you no matter what answer you give me, provided that you are honest. I don't recall exactly when. But a long time ago, an archmage shared his method of creating artificial dungeon cores to the rest of the world. So, it would be fair to assume that many kingdoms eventually learned how to make these so-called artificial cores and replaced the original cores." "That's correct." "Typical." Sera rose from her seat. With a flick of her hand, the chair fashioned from intertwining roots beneath her unraveled and slithered back into the soil. Then, she fixed her gaze on Prince Leo. How capable are these artificial cores? The prince fidgeted with his fingers. The best ones I know can manage up to A-tier monsters, equivalent to A-rank adventurers. Interesting, and I assume that cores that can produce such powerful monsters must be rare. Rare would be a major understatement. Elaborate. What I mean is that the cost of manufacturing a core that is capable of creating A-tier monsters is so expensive that it's difficult for a kingdom to have more than 2 or 3 dungeons with such cores in their territory. How adorable. Pardon. It's nothing. Just a slip of the tongue. Sera strode over to stand beside the prince. She clasped her hands together and summoned a giant hand made out of roots that rose from the ground, cradling the limp body of a man wearing an ornate red hooded cloak. She leaned closer to the prince. This adventurer I killed, who is he and how strong is he compared to others? Initially, the prince stiffened at the sight. He's George of the Green Dragoons, A-rank adventurer and among the best in the kingdom. Her grip on the prince's shoulder tightened momentarily as she let out a brief, mocking laugh. Well then, I've heard all that I need to know for now. The suddenness of her laughter caused the prince to jolt slightly. Are you going to let me go? Sera placed her left hand near Prince Leo's back. Of course, but I suggest you close your eyes, this will be painful. The prince looked a bit apprehensive at first. But he eventually nodded and closed his eyes. With that, Sera counted down. In 3, 2. As she reached 1, Prince Leo winced, a sharp intake of breath hissed through his clenched teeth as the roots embedded in his back retracted, unwinding from his flesh and sinking back into the ground. While this was happening, a soft, green light emanated from Sera's left hand, working in tandem with the retraction of the roots to heal the wounds they left behind. In a few seconds, the roots released the prince completely and withdrew into the soil below. The wounds on his back were non-existent as Sera's healing made quick work of them. You can open your eyes, Prince. Prince Leo cautiously opened his eyes. He looked surprised as he examined his body and twisted to glance behind his back that was without any wounds. Gradually, he managed to stand and turn to face Sera. I honestly can't believe you didn't just kill me. Then you can consider yourself fortunate. The prince cast a lingering look at the spirit tree before returning his gaze to Sera. You do understand that my father will bring more forces to burn down that tree again, right? Sera stepped closer to the prince. Let him, the spirit tree could always use more mortal souls to feed on. Why you're a monster? And you are wasting my time. Leave now, human, before I change my mind. As the prince sprinted as fast as he could, Sera remained where she stood and let out a slight hum. She estimated that the prince would collapse within 8 to 9 seconds at most. Yet, after approximately 11 seconds, she heard a pained scream followed by a heavy thud. Shame, I slightly miscalculated the dosage. Perhaps I should try to find more humans to practice on in the future. Sera turned and walked towards the source of the commotion. There, she found the prince face planted on the ground. The prince's body, from his legs to his waist, had turned into wood. Even his hands had hardened, their fingers stiffening as they took on the appearance of tree branches. Struggling against the pain, the prince barely managed to push his upper body off the ground. You lied to me. Sera knelt down and brought her face close to his. I did let you go, didn't I? She stood and turned her back on him before beginning her walk back to the spirit tree. Just be glad that the poison worked slow enough for you to experience a few seconds of freedom. By the time she arrived back at the base of the spirit tree, the prince's screams had gone quiet. Now that all the nuisances were gone, it was time to get to work. Sera approached the spirit tree and pressed her antlers gently against its rough bark. She closed her eyes, allowing herself to become attuned to the pulse of the tree. It was her duty to connect with the tree, and if she couldn't even do that, there would be no reason for her to exist. Yet, suddenly, she was forced to take a step back and breathe. A torrent of emotions rushed through the connection. Fear, anger, sadness, and so much more, each demanding her immediate attention. The onslaught of feelings made her stagger as her mind struggled to cope with the intensity. Disjointed images rapidly flickered before Sera's eyes. She saw visions of countless other silver-leafed trees and saplings, the spirit tree's offspring, flourishing in hidden groves. But each one was eventually destroyed as adventurers descended upon them, removing them with axes, fire, and magic. The emotions that came with these scenes were sharp and visceral. It was as though each dying tree was crying out to her, each one a soul lost to the relentless advance of the mortal races. Turning to lean her back against the trunk of the spirit tree, Sera took a moment to collect herself and drew in deep, steadying breaths. What she was going to have to do next was almost certainly going to be painful. But no amount of pain was unbearable to her if it was for the sake of the spirit tree. She clasped her hands together as she steeled her resolve. The first touch of the roots against her skin was deceptively gentle, a stark contrast to the brutal invasion that followed. They pierced her flesh and burrowed deep until they had integrated with her spine. Sera's breath hitched in her throat as she let out a strangled gasp. Her lips now tinged with dark, viscous sap. Through blurred vision and gritted teeth, Sera focused on the space before her as the world dissolved into an interface only she could see. Please, answer me, please. Accessing dungeon system. Analyzing user. Name, Sera. Species, Elder Dryad. Level, 300. Overall challenge rating, S. Access privilege, Administrator. By now, the pain Sera felt earlier had disappeared completely as her integration with the spirit tree was successful. Yet, when she tried to navigate further through the system, Sera nearly lurched as pain struck her again. System corrupted, function unavailable. Things were much worse than she could have ever anticipated. When she tried to access another function, the same words appeared. System corrupted, function unavailable. As Sera delved deeper into the corrupted system, a sharp pain seized her once more. Black ichor trickled from her nose while her body trembled uncontrollably from the effort to navigate through the damaged interfaces. Each attempt to access the system's functions was met with the same pain. But eventually, she found one function that was still accessible. System reset available. Upon seeing this remaining function, Sera's heart sank. She exhaled a deep, resigned sigh before tentatively selecting the option, bracing herself for what was to come. Warning: this function can only be launched by an administrator. Non-administrators that attempt to use the system reset function will be terminated. Do you wish to proceed? Sera whispered, yes. Final warning: the system will reset to rank 1 as a result of this function. The system will delete all prior progress including experience and any other records it has prior to executing the reset. The system will then respawn in the nearest suitable location. Lastly, the current administrator will be bound to the new rank 1 system. Are you sure that you still wish to proceed? Hesitation briefly took hold of Sera as she considered her choices. The option to leave the spirit tree as it was and search for another solution flickered through her mind. But she knew that more humans would come for her soon if she didn't act. And there was no guarantee that she could find an alternative way to save the spirit tree in a reasonable amount of time. Hence, despite her reservations, Sera made her choice. The ground beneath her feet trembled as her gaze swept across the collapsing interior. The walls nearby crumbled before her, unleashing clouds of dust and debris that veiled the air in a thick fog. The roots in the chamber rapidly decayed until they turned to shriveled-up husks of what they once were. A sudden weakness overtook Sera. Her limbs became limp. Her head lolled forward, unsupported by her neck, as a wave of vertigo overwhelmed her senses. Her vision blurred, the edges darkening until she could see nothing but blackness. She felt an irresistible force pulling her towards the spirit tree, a sensation akin to being drawn into something she couldn't escape. Countless emotions engulfed Sera. Though pain was constant company, a strange peace touched her heart as countless visions flashed through her mind. She saw a time when the spirit tree's roots and saplings had spread throughout every corner of the land. The dungeons thrived in this golden age, their entrances revered and feared by all who approached them. It was an era when some dungeons were even transformed into places of worship, filled to the brim with offerings from those who sought the spirit tree's favor. A place where priests and priestesses chanted hymns calling upon blessings. Yet, these visions soon faded away like mist evaporating in the morning sun. A sense of heaviness weighed on Sera's mind, each passing second pulling her deeper into a thick fog of unconsciousness. Her thoughts gradually grew sluggish as her eyelids drooped. But, before she succumbed to the darkness completely, the Elder Dryad made a promise to herself. No matter the cost, I will bring back the fear and respect that dungeons once commanded, and with it, the rightful reverence that the spirit tree deserves. Chapter 3: Burning Beast. There was no describing the feeling of being unmade and remade all at once. Sera felt each vertebra in her spine twist and arch. The essence of her being, the fibers that composed her body, knitted together thread by thread. Her limbs were reconstructed next, tentative and quivering, reaching out to a world they couldn't touch or see just yet. Gradually, Sera felt herself becoming whole once again. until she was awoken by a piercing light that strained her eyes. Where in the world am I? She blinked a few times as she glanced around the area. The Elder Dryad found herself in a small room. Rows of human skulls were fitted into niches carved into the walls while 4 blue fire torches hung from them, casting a soft glow over the limestone floor. A large glowing sphere hovered in the middle of the room, almost as wide as a wild boar. Its surface shimmered with unnaturally bright runes. The sphere itself continuously rippled as if liquid, always reshaping and rearranging itself without any inputs. But before Sera realized it, her legs were already moving towards the sphere. However, as she got closer to the strange object, a visceral repulsion surged through her. It was as if the very core of her being recoiled in instinctive horror from the object. The sickening feeling burrowed deep into her stomach. She figured that the sphere had to be one of the so-called artificial cores that the prince mentioned before. Which meant that it must be destroyed. She brought her right hand to the sharper end of her antlers. The edge bit into the flesh of her palm, causing thick, black sap to well up from the wound. Holding her injured palm forward, Sera fixed a glare on the sphere. Bark-like tendrils erupted from the wound on her hand. They were extensions of her will, reaching for the sphere with a destructive hunger. The tendrils snaked through the air and coiled around the object tightly. Cracks spread like lightning marks across its surface, until the sphere shattered into countless pieces that scattered across the stone floor. Sera's tendrils receded into her hand rapidly. The wound from which they had emerged sealed itself, leaving not even the slightest trace. Driven by instinct, the Elder Dryad moved towards the pile of debris that was the sphere's remains. She stood before it and extended her hand, then closed her eyes and drew a deep breath. As she focused, the room responded with a deep rumble that vibrated through the stones and air. It grew louder and louder, until silence returned all at once. When she opened her eyes, Sera saw a sapling that barely reached halfway up her calves. Even in this small form, she could still recognize the spirit tree's earlier life state. Its leaves were the same vibrant silver that seemed to capture the essence of life itself, contrasting sharply against its pitch-black body. After giving a solemn bow, Sera turned her back against the sapling and closed her eyes. She waited patiently, until she felt the familiar sensation of roots burrowing themselves into her flesh. Despite this, she didn't feel any pain. The roots felt much smaller and more delicate than what the tree used to have. System reboot completed. Limited functions restored. Accessing dungeon system. Analyzing user. Name, Sera. Species, Elder Dryad. Access privilege, Administrator. Level, 300. Magic, 300, rating, S. Magic resistance, 300, rating, S. Physical defense, 100, rating, D. Strength, 50, rating, E. Speed, 150, rating, C. Vitality, 300, rating, S. Overall challenge rating, S. Warning, user's powers have been restricted. Sera's brows furrowed, her eyes narrowing as she observed the floating words hovering before her eyes. Her lips parted slightly, caught between a frown and a question. This is quite odd, the system states that my powers have been restricted, yet, my stats all appear to be untouched and I'm still at the maximum possible level. In which case, maybe this restriction is affecting some other part of me. Administrator access detected. Displaying advanced diagnostics. Current user's capabilities are constrained by system parameters. Limitations will be re-evaluated for potential removal upon enhancement of system strength. The system has identified the following capabilities as hazardous. Spring path, locked. Summer path, locked. Autumn path, locked. Winter path, locked. For some reason, Sera couldn't remember anything about the paths that the system mentioned. It's as if a fog is clouding my mind, perhaps the spirit tree doesn't want me to know about these paths just yet. While it was a pity that she wasn't at full strength, Sera knew that she should still be strong enough to manage any threats to the spirit tree for the foreseeable future. But at least for now, it seemed that if the tree were to grow, then she'd also be able to tap into more of her true strength. Displaying dungeon status. Core rank, 1. Core experience, 0. Dungeon boss, Sera. Number of floors, 1. Mana, 100/100. Monsters, 1. The spirit tree's status didn't appear out of line either considering the system reset. Unfortunately for her, she couldn't sense the presence of any mortals nearby, meaning she wouldn't be able to feed the tree for some time. One thing that did bother her more than the lack of prey, however, was the fact that the spirit tree only registered one floor and one monster. Sera wasn't familiar with artificial cores, but even she knew that there was no possible way that the large core she destroyed earlier was made for a dungeon with only a single floor. But for now, there was just one last thing to check. Displaying monster unlock options. 1. Unlock one random F-tier monster, cost, 100 core experience. It was good to see that the system could still produce monsters. Though, her options were about as limited as she expected. Sera mentally commanded the roots fused to her back to recede. And as they left her spine and flesh, she walked towards a set of large stone doors at the opposite end of the room. She stood before the doors, each etched with intricate iconography. There were depictions of humans slaying various mythical beasts, dragons, hydras, and other creatures of legend. The imagery was carved with such detail that they almost seemed to move in the flickering light from the torches. Though she had no love for humans, Sera didn't mind admiring their craftsmanship where it was warranted. Regardless, she needed to get out. Sera almost raised a hand to command roots to assault the stone doors. Yet, she suddenly stopped herself as she remembered something important. There are no roots for me to use here. Resorting to a more direct approach, Sera spat out a seed into her right hand. She then knelt down and placed the seed just beneath the stone doors, gently nudging it into a small crevice where the stone touched the ground. After taking a few steps back, she snapped her fingers. The seed she planted erupted into life, sprouting a network of silverthorned vines that surged with unnatural vigor. In seconds, the vines had infiltrated even the smallest gaps in the door, causing the stone to crack under the immense pressure. The stone doors crumbled from the inside out. Pieces of it fell away, leaving a gaping maw in their wake. With another snap of her fingers, the vines decomposed until there was barely any trace of their existence. Sera brushed away clouds of dust with her hands as she walked through. When she emerged on the other side, Sera glanced up and saw a sunless, drab, grey sky greeting her. Countless shriveled-up dead trees covered the landscape. It was surprising that not a single one of them had fallen onto the ashy, dry soil. Approaching one of the trees, she extended a hand to touch its bark. Unsurprisingly, it immediately withered under her touch. And when Sera tried to infuse her magic into the tree, instead it dissolved to dust, leaving her fingers streaked with grey. This place was once a wild dungeon. The humans must have replaced the core with an artificial one only recently. She closed her eyes, her hand lingering in the air where the tree had once stood. She bowed her head as a profound sadness washed over her. Just how many dungeons have been lost before my arrival? When she glanced back at the entrance to the spirit tree's chamber, Sera tried her best to make sense of it all. There has to be a reason for why the spirit tree chose to send me out only in the very last possible moment. Sera raised a hand to her antlers, feeling their smooth, curved texture as she channeled her magic through them. The antlers crackled with energy, the bone becoming brittle under her touch. She broke off a piece, then another, and then a third as the shards of antler clattered in her palm. She gathered these pieces in her hand, crushing them into fine powder while infusing them with her magic. The crushed antler dust swirled in her hand, until they reformed and took the shape of small, black seeds. The Elder Dryad scattered these seeds in front of the entrance and across the area surrounding the spirit tree's chamber. While her antlers regenerated, the seeds sprouted into thick, twisting roots that wove themselves into a dense protective canopy. This should be enough to stave away any potential threats for the foreseeable future. Closing her eyes, Sera focused and attuned herself to the environment. She extended her senses outward, feeling the cool earth beneath her feet, the sounds of the wind through the leaves, and the distant echo of water rippling. She reached deeper, her awareness stretching far beyond. There is something powerful nearby. Soon, she felt a faint hum of energy in the distance, a large source of magic pulsing like a heartbeat. She opened her eyes, her focus sharpening on the direction of the magical resonance. Her movements became almost trance-like as she walked by following her instincts, each step deliberate and unhurried. Sera's path led her to a lake, its surface smooth and glass-like. She knelt at the edge, her fingers trailing through the water. The lake bed was soft, a mixture of silt and decaying leaves that swirled around her touch. She sensed a shift in the currents, a ripple that disturbed the stillness. Something was moving beneath the surface. It's a creature, one that can also sense magic. Instinctively, Sera withdrew her hand and stepped away from the water's edge, her gaze scanning the lake with renewed caution. She pricked her hand on the sharp end of her antlers, causing thick, black sap to leak from the wound. Then, she spat out a few silvery seeds into her right hand and clenched it tight, readying herself for what was to come. Suddenly, the earth beneath Sera's feet trembled so violently that it nearly sent her sprawling. She fought for balance, her legs tensing as she regained her footing. Her gaze snapped to the lake, where she saw how the water rapidly churned about. Bubbles rapidly surged to the surface, bursting and sending hot steam spiraling upwards. The air filled with a misty haze, blurring the line between water and sky. The lake's surface erupted as a figure shrouded in a mantle of orange light launched into the air with explosive force, sending towering waves hurtling towards the shore. Sera spun around just as a thunderous thud resonated from behind her, the ground vibrating beneath her feet. The sheer power of the eruption sent gusts of wind whipping across the lake, flattening the dead trees at the water's edge. It was a creature of monumental proportions. The beast's skin was a deep, almost charcoal grey with an ashy texture. While its fur was composed of bright orange flames that crackled and writhed with each of the beast's thunderous breaths. The beast's head was unmistakably canine, with a long, pointed muzzle and a set of sharp, glistening fangs that jutted from its maw. And every time the beast exhaled, it sent a burst of searing heat into the air. When the creature opened its maw, it unleashed a blood-curdling screech that tore at the air. Then, the beast charged, its massive body moving with astonishing speed. Sera pointed her wounded hand forward, channeling her strength to summon black tendrils that surged towards the beast. Despite its massive size, the creature managed to dodge, causing her tendrils to slam against the ground and miss their target entirely. In the midst of the beast's advance, Sera threw the silvery seeds she had clenched so tightly. The seeds transformed mid-flight, blossoming into several silver-thorned vines. They entwined themselves around the beast's legs and its broad, heaving torso. The sudden restraint caught the beast off guard, its momentum turning against it as the vines pulled tight. The beast stumbled and fell. The impact of its colossal form hitting the ground sent a small shockwave through the area. But as the beast struggled against the vines, Sera noticed a single molten tear drip from the creature's eye. It was a sight that left her questioning whether the tear was a result of the pain from her vines, or if it was caused by something else entirely. Yet, Sera wasn't given much time to think as the beast's intense heat melted the thorns. With a loud snap of its jaws, the beast broke free from the vines and charged at Sera again. This time, Sera waited for the beast to come close. Just as its jaws were about to close on her, she summoned tendrils from her left hand that lifted her body off the ground to move out of the way. Unfortunately, the beast's speed exceeded her expectations. Just as her tendrils propelled her upward, the creature's jaws snapped shut, severing her left arm at the elbow. A sharp, tearing pain exploded through her senses. Black sap spattered in the beast's wake as it retreated with a victorious snarl, plunging back into the water with a massive splash. Sera winced as she hit the ground. But, as she pushed herself back up, it was not the pain that drew a curse from her lips, but the annoyance at her miscalculation. The sting of her pride hurt her far more than any physical injury. That was pathetic. I need to be more focused in the future. Still, she swiftly thought of how losing her arm could still be an opportunity. When the beast re-emerged from the water, she pointed the stump of what was once her left arm at it. Countless more tendrils grew out of the wound and struck the monster mid-air, slamming it back into the lake with a force that sent ripples sprawling. She then touched the stump with her free hand, causing the tendrils that emerged from it to rapidly decay, allowing her to detach herself from the tendrils and run. The beast is returning soon, I can feel it. While she ran away, her left arm regenerated. New tendrils emerged from the stump, they thickened and intertwined, mimicking the form and function of muscles, layering over each other until they formed a perfect replica of her lost limb. Gradually, these fibers softened and refined their appearance as a new layer of pale skin formed over them, restoring her arm to its pristine, original state. Behind Sera, the sound of a loud splash heralded the beast's return. As she turned to see the creature, Sera noticed how it looked almost sad. Molten tears carved paths down its scorched cheeks. Yet, this did nothing to stop the monster from releasing a torrent of flame towards her with a wrathful cry. With the flames roaring towards her, Sera stood firm, not flinching as the flames engulfed her. The heat turned the ground beneath her feet to smoldering ash, but she remained unburnt, her gaze steady on the beast as it roared in frustration. Sera calmly placed a hand on the ground. Her magic flowed from her palm into the ground beneath with a focus that was as unbreakable as it was tranquil. Around the beast, several large flower buds emerged from the ground and blossomed rapidly into full bloom. In its confusion, the beast tried biting off one of the flower petals at first, but quickly spat it out as it turned into a silvery powder. All of the nearby flowers emanated silver dust that clouded the air, quickly thickening into a shimmering haze. The beast's movements became slower, more unstable. Even as it approached Sera, it no longer ran, instead, it wobbled from side to side, its strength visibly diminishing with each step. Finally, the creature fell to the ground and collapsed in a heap. The silver dust had taken its toll. Sera snapped her fingers, and the blossoms that had subdued the beast now rapidly faded into silver dust that was scattered through the air. She cautiously approached the fallen beast, alert for any sign of it getting back up. Yet, as she drew closer, a deep snoring reached her ears. The creature was fast asleep, oblivious to the world around it. The Elder Dryad knew exactly what the creature was. How the mighty have fallen, to think that the primal beasts of old would now be used as glorified guard dogs. The beast's form shrunk quickly, its massive bulk gradually diminishing as its orange flames extinguished. The transformation was marked by a series of grotesque, crunching sounds as its bones realigned and muscles reformed. In a matter of seconds, the beast was gone. A beastkin man now lay in its place, his body curled up in a fetal position. He wore a tattered brown tunic that barely clung to his frame, along with similarly disheveled pants, while his shaggy red hair cascaded around his shoulders. Were it not for the pair of wolf ears and furry tail that was curled beside him, he would have looked not too different from a human, albeit one with coarse grey skin. A beastkin shifter, he could potentially be useful. I could always use more pawns to help with matters in and out of the dungeon. Sera closed her eyes and extended her senses, feeling the faint pulse of life within the beastkin. She opened her eyes and spat a seed onto the ground beside him. The seed quickly sprouted, unfurling into roots that snaked around the beastkin's limbs, binding his arms and legs to the ground. A small precaution, just in case. Kneeling beside him, Sera examined the beastkin closely. His body bore numerous injuries, but she could tell that most of the wounds weren't caused by her attacks. The burns and deep gashes on his skin seemed more consistent with the strain of his transformation rather than the physical damage inflicted during their confrontation. His breathing was shallow, and his muscles occasionally twitched involuntarily. Placing her hands gently on his chest, Sera channeled her healing magic into him. A soft green light emanated from her palms, bathing his body in a soothing glow. Gradually, the worst of his wounds closed as the charred flesh knitted itself back together. Chapter 4 Anger. Sera moved back and waited as the beastkin slowly stirred awake. His muscles twitching as she watched cautiously. Gradually, he opened his eyes, slightly drowsy at first. But as soon as he saw the vines binding his limbs, panic flooded his gaze. He thrashed around violently as he yelled, "Alpa! Alpa!" Sera rolled her eyes at the sight. Fantastic, this one's a lunatic. She hoped the beastkin would calm down on his own after a few seconds, but his wild movements and incessant cries grated on her patience. "I'm giving this 5 more seconds, 5, 4, 3, 2. Unfortunately, when Sera finally counted to 1, the beastkin showed no signs of stopping his yelling and thrashing. Seeing this, she covered a part of her hand before unfurling it to reveal a bright yellow flower. She approached the beastkin's head and gently blew on the flower, causing it to dissipate into a cloud of yellowish powder that enveloped his face. The beastkin's wild eyes quickly lost their frantic edge, his breathing stabilizing as the powder's effects took hold. The beastkin's body relaxed, the tension ebbing away as he inhaled the soothing substance. Sera knelt down beside him and observed the change in his demeanor. His chest rose and fell steadily now, the violent thrashing replaced by a more peaceful state. Satisfied that he was calm, Sera snapped her fingers in front of his eyes to draw his attention. "Focus, I'm not letting you rest just yet." The beastkin gradually calmed down, his breathing slowing as he turned to look at Sera. Where? Sera exhaled an exasperated sigh, thinking to herself that she may have overdone the dosage. The calming powder had clearly taken a stronger effect than she intended. Either way, he's calmed down a bit at the very least. She knelt beside the beastkin's head and asked, "Can you say your name?" The beastkin struggled, his lips trembling as he tried to form the words. Ermo. Seeing Ermo about to fall asleep again, Sera slapped him across the face to force him awake. His head jerked to the side, and he coughed a few times before glaring at her. "Who the fuck are you?" Sera's gaze settled on the beastkin. She noted the tension in his muscles, the way his fingers dug into the dirt as if seeking an anchor. "He's still not ready." Her own expression remained serene, a stark contrast to the anxiety radiating from him. "Calm down." Ermo, however, did not heed her words. His eyes darted around the area to look for a way to escape, His muscles strained against the vines binding him, the veins on his neck bulged as he struggled against the unyielding grip of the vines. Sera's eyes narrowed slightly. It would seem that I need to assert myself more. She clenched her fist, causing the vines around Ermo's body to tighten with a creaking sound as if they were drawing strength from the ground. The pressure increased, and a scream of pain tore from Ermo's throat. His cries were filled with pain and desperation, each breath a shuddering gasp that stretched minutes into feeling like eternity. Until finally, Ermo stopped struggling. Sera slowly loosened the vines to ease the tension ever so slightly. The vines slackened to allow Ermo to catch his breath. His eyes now held a hollow look of resignation instead of the rebellious fire they had earlier. The beastkin turned to her weakly. Just kill me. Have you considered that if I wanted you dead, that we would not be having this conversation to begin with? Whatever, do your worst. Sera studied him closely. She could see the hollowness in his eyes and how his voice lacked the fiery determination that had driven his initial struggles. This man has lost his reason to fight. Applying more coercion might not achieve the compliance that I desire, perhaps, a different approach is necessary. She sat down to the ground next to the beastkin, crossed her legs and looked at him with a softer expression. Is Alba your wife? A tear welled up in Ermo's eye before slowly trailing down his cheek as he exhaled deeply. She's probably taken away as a slave or dead, just like everybody else. Do you remember what actually happened to her? If you're not gonna do anything to me, just fuck off. Try to think for a second, do you even know where you are? Ermo shifted his gaze away from Sera. His eyes lingered on a distant point while his shoulders hunched slightly. Sera observed him for a moment longer before standing up. She moved away and then willed the vines binding him to loosen just enough for him to break free. Time to take more extreme measures. Immediately, Ermo seized the opportunity and ran away from Sera, moving as far and as fast as he could manage. His figure quickly disappeared into the surrounding landscape. Instead of chasing after him, Sera broke off a small piece of her antler, feeling the familiar resistance and crackle of energy as it snapped. She crushed it in her hand to turn the fragments into a small, black seed. She knelt down and planted the seed into the ground, then covered it lightly with soil. In a few seconds, the seed sprouted and rapidly grew into a large tree with black bark and silver leaves. Sera sat down on its trunk with her back against the rough bark. She closed her eyes and counted the seconds as they passed. 1, 2, 3. As she counted, her thoughts remained focused on the passing time. She knew Ermo would return sooner or later, as the beastkin wouldn't have a chance at leaving the dungeon without her help. He didn't look particularly knowledgeable when he ran away, merely fueled by emotion and desperation. After some more waiting, Sera opened her eyes as she sensed someone approaching her. She spotted Ermo's figure coming into view. The beastkin approached slowly, panting heavily, his steps faltering with exhaustion. When Ermo finally reached her, he collapsed to his knees and gasped for breath. Sera smiled slightly, a hint of satisfaction in her eyes. 20 minutes and 56 seconds. Ermo looked confused as he pushed himself to sit down. What? Sera remained seated against the tree, her smile widening just a fraction more. The time it took for you to come back. 20 minutes and 56 seconds. Hold on, you knew that it was going to be impossible for me to leave, didn't you? And so what if I did? You ran off before I could say anything. An awkward silence stretched between Ermo and Sera, the air thick with unspoken tension. The beastkin's hesitation was palpable in the slight tremor of his hands, which he tried to hide by clenching them into fists. His shoulders remained hunched, as if he were trying to shield himself from an invisible weight pressing down on him. But finally, Ermo broke the silence. I'm sorry for losing my cool earlier. But can you please help me leave this place? Sera tilted her head slightly, eyes narrowing with a hint of amusement. I don't think so. But, if you'd at least talk to me, I might reconsider. Fine, what do you want to know? First question, why do you want to leave this place so badly? I need to go back to my village and see if there's anyone alive. Could you explain exactly what happened there? Ermo looked away, a deep frown creasing his forehead. The lines on his face deepened, and his eyes darkened with the weight of painful memories. His jaw tightened, muscles clenching as he struggled to find the words. Sera sensed his reluctance and moved closer. She extended her hand, hovering it near him as a soft, green glow emanated from her palm. It bathed Ermo in a gentle light that healed his wounds. Ermo looked very surprised as his injuries rapidly healed. He instinctively reached up to touch the areas where the pain had been moments before. The deep frown on his forehead smoothed out, replaced by a look of astonished relief. How are you able to use healing magic? Are you a goddess? Sera's hand still hovered near him as the green glow continued to mend his injuries. Do not trouble yourself with the details. What matters is how you feel now. Ermo flexed his fingers and moved his shoulder, testing the restored strength. I feel fine, he admitted with a slightly quieter voice. Thank you. She moved back and leaned against the tree again. Your appreciation is noted, but I'd prefer it if you'd be more open with me. Respectfully, I still have no idea why you seem to care so much about me. Because I want to get a better idea of who you are, and maybe, we could even help each other. You're not with them, are you? I have no idea who or what you're talking about. Ermo sighed. I used to live in a village on the border with Lizaria. That's why I was one of the first to get hit when the Lizarians started the war. And what exactly happened to your village? The Lizarians raided my village. They either killed or captured everyone they saw. Don't think anyone was spared. A moment of silence passed between them as Sera absorbed his words. Do you remember exactly how you awakened your powers? Ermo's expression shifted to one of confusion. He clutched at his head, as if trying to piece together fragmented memories. When they were about to take Alpa, my wife. I became so enraged. Everything else became a blur after that. Did you comprehend what was transpiring as you transformed? No, I don't remember anything when I transformed. The last thing I know is seeing them take Alpa away from me. Sera's expression softened, and she leaned back against the tree trunk. From what you've said, it's possible that your wife is still out there, perhaps your transformation bought time for her and some others to escape. You really think so? Obviously, I can't promise you anything. But I saw firsthand how powerful your transformation was, and if your wife managed to use that as a chance to escape, she could be out there somewhere. Ermo's eyes filled with a glimmer of hope as he looked at Sera. Please, can you help me leave whatever this place is? I can help you with that, and so much more. What do you mean? Sera rose to her feet and extended her arms outward with her fingers splayed. The tree behind her responded instantly to her will. Its roots burrowed deeper into the earth while the branches stretched and twisted and reached higher towards the sky. I'm here to start something far greater than anything you could imagine, and right now, I require an extra pair of hands to help me. Ermo stood up slowly, legs trembling slightly as he rose. His breath caught in his throat as he took an involuntary step back, heart pounding in his chest. But why would you need help from someone like me? Sera stepped closer. Because I see potential in you. I can't promise you that you'll be able to find your wife if you help me, but at the very least, you can definitely exact vengeance on those humans who have wronged you. Ermo hesitated visibly as he considered Sera's words. His breath hitched slightly, and he shifted his weight from one foot to the other. After a long moment of contemplation, he extended his hand towards her. All right, I'll work with you. Sera clasped his hand firmly. Thank you. And what should I call you? Just Sera is fine, but you're free to address me however you wish. Calling you by name just doesn't feel right, mind if I just call you boss instead? If that works for you, I don't see why not. Chapter 5 System. Sera's gaze swept across the horizon as she searched for a clearing amidst the sea of dead trees. Each step she took sent dry leaves skittering away, the brittle crunch of twigs and debris underfoot echoing in the still air. Ermo trailed closely behind, his movements less certain. What are you looking for? An open space, Sera replied, her voice calm yet focused. Her gaze never wavered from the barren landscape, eyes sharp as they searched for any hint of a clearing. Everything looks pretty much the same, minus the lake. You're certainly not wrong. I'll go and make some space myself. The Elder Dryad approached a nearby dead tree. Gently, she reached out and touched the grey and brittle bark, feeling it crumble away under her fingers. She took a step back and raised her hand to her antlers. Her fingers traced along the rough surface until they found a specific spot. She closed her eyes, channeling her magic through her fingertips. A faint, ethereal glow pulsed through the antlers, and the once sturdy bark softened, becoming brittle under her touch. Then, she snapped off a small piece of the antler. The fragment crumbled easily in her hand before disintegrating into a fine black powder. The dark dust shimmered faintly as she cupped it in her palm, her fingers moving deftly to mold it into tiny seeds. As her antlers slowly regenerated, Sera scattered the black seeds around the clearing with a deliberate flick of her wrist. The seeds fell to the ground like droplets of ink splashing onto an old parchment, each one landing with a barely audible thud. The moment they touched the earth, tiny black shoots emerged from the seeds and pushed through the soil. Roots soon burst out of the soil with a violent force. They wrapped around the trunks of the surrounding trees, causing them to rapidly crumble to dust. The sharpened tips of the roots then pierced through more trees as each one was destroyed in seconds. As the last of the dead trees were cleared, the roots retreated back into the ground, leaving a wide space in their wake. Ermo glanced around, his eyes taking in the new environment. "What are we planning on doing here, boss?" Sera turned to him. "I plan on conducting a small evaluation." What kind?" "To put it simply, I want to confirm the exact triggers of your transformation, and then maybe try to help you control it." "That's easy, I get angry, and then I transform." "But do you transform every time you get angry? For instance, if someone were being incredibly rude to you, would you shift into your primal beast form?" Ermo scratched his head as he shifted his weight from one foot to the other. "Hey, guess that's a fair point. My current hypothesis is that only extreme emotions trigger your transformation. However, do you understand why this is the case?" "Nope, haven't got a clue." "In that case, allow me to educate you. Your transformation is actually utilizing a form of nature magic." "Don't mean to be rude, but that doesn't make any sense to me. Isn't nature magic just all about plants and wildlife?" Sera shook her head and sighed. "Listen carefully to what I'm going to explain to you, maybe it could even be a step forward in you being able to control your powers." Ermo nodded and looked at her intently. "I'm all ears." "The first thing you should remember is that nature magic is the oldest type of magic to have ever existed. Every other school of magic such as elemental magic, illusion magic, and so on, derive their roots from nature magic." "Okay, got it, but what does this have to do with my transformation?" "Your ancestors, like many other peoples during their era, searched for other ways of using magic instead of using nature magic. Can you guess why?" Ermo thought for a moment as he pieced together Sera's explanation. He soon pointed to her antlers. "I noticed you were using part of your antlers to grow the roots. And if you said that my transformation also involves nature magic, I'm guessing my ancestors were trying to figure out an improvement to nature magic because it was taking a toll on their bodies." Sera nodded and smiled. "That's correct, and overusing nature magic often led to death for mortal spellcasters because they were unable to pay the high costs required. Is that why the shamans I know all use weird ingredients and incantations when using magic?" "Exactly, it's a way to not only distribute the burden of magic on the body, but also to narrow down its purpose to prevent excess strain. Of course, those who are more naturally gifted with magic can afford to do things normal people can't." "When you say gifted, what do you mean exactly?" "Magic users who are born with a higher proclivity to the arcane can better exchange the mana within their bodies for power and will require less tools to help them. Your ability to transform is an example of this." "But if that's the case, why is transforming so painful for me?" "It's because you're still inexperienced when it comes to using your abilities, but the potential is there." Ermo exhaled a sigh, his shoulders slumping slightly. "It's a bit difficult to practice when you awaken your powers at the last second." Sera shook her head. "What I said earlier wasn't meant as an insult. Besides, mastering any form of magic isn't easy, let alone something closer to nature magic. How do I get better at transforming then?" "First of all, we need to condition you to be able to trigger your transformation willingly." "You mean I need to learn how to control my anger?" "Yes and no." One of Sera's roots sprouted next to her, its tip sharpening into a fine point. Without hesitation, she pricked her palm on the root's tip, drawing out thick, black sap that oozed from the wound. She held her hand up for Ermo to see. "I want you to do this." Ermo raised an eyebrow, his expression one of disbelief. "You want me to stab myself?" "Exchange is one of the most basic principles of nature magic. You need to sacrifice something in order to reap the benefits." As she spoke, delicate flowers bloomed along her arm, their petals unfurling as blood dripped from her wound. "Most people wouldn't get much out of injuring themselves, but you have greater potential." Ermo looked hesitant but finally nodded as he readied himself. He extended his hand towards the root, fingers trembling slightly. With a deep breath, he pricked his palm on the sharp tip, drawing his blood. He winced at the pain, then closed his eyes as he tried to focus on triggering his transformation. His muscles tensed and his breathing grew labored. Beads of sweat formed along his hairline, trickling down to his brow. His fingers twitched, grasping at the empty air as if trying to pull the power into his being. Yet, despite his efforts, nothing happened. After a few agonizing moments, he opened his eyes. Sorry, I just can't do it. The flowers on Sera's arm turned into a sickly brown before they fell away. Each petal shimmered for a brief moment before dissolving into the air. The wound along her forearm knitted together slowly as it healed. The Elder Dryad then approached Ermo and placed her hand over his, healing the beastkin with her greenish light. No need to apologize, for now, just follow me. There is still much to be done. Sera led Ermo to the entrance of the spirit tree's chamber. The beastkin tilted his head when he saw the entrance, which was all covered in dense roots. Did you need help clearing this? The Elder Dryad took a step forward. That won't be necessary, just stay back for a moment. At her words, the roots retracted and parted away, moving aside to reveal the chamber beyond. With the path now open, Sera moved forward. However, just before crossing the threshold into the sacred space, she paused and turned back to Ermo. When we enter, I want you on your best behavior, understood? The beastkin appeared confused for a moment, but eventually nodded. Right, sure. Both stepped into the chamber. Sera's eyes immediately sought out the spirit tree itself, noting with satisfaction the spread of its roots. The chamber had been transformed, the roots covering every inch of the room. Turning to gauge Ermo's reaction, Sera caught the awe in his wide eyes. The sapling you see in front of you is the spirit tree. Don't mean to be rude, but, is it supposed to be that small? I heard some stories of it before, and I thought that the spirit tree was huge. Much has happened, and I was forced to revert the spirit tree into a much younger life state. But that's beside the point, stand over there please. Ermo complied, stepping cautiously until he was positioned right beside the spirit tree. Here. Sera gave a confirming nod. Perfect. With that, she turned her back against the spirit tree. And almost immediately, she felt the familiar sensation of the tree's roots gently burrowing into her back. As she stood there, Sera mentally navigated through the influx of words and data that flowed into her consciousness from the tree. Once she had sifted through the usual items, her focus shifted to one specific function. Entity analysis initiated. A series of thin black roots silently emerged from the ground and snaked their way up Ermo's body, wrapping around his legs and arms with a gentle but firm grasp. The beastkin's body tensed at first. But a sharp glance from Sera made him freeze on the spot. Processing request. Displaying status. Name, Ermo. Species, Beastkin Shifter. Level, 200. Magic, 50, rating, E. Magic Resistance, 100, rating, D. Physical Defense, 120, rating, D. Strength, 200, rating, B. Speed, 180, rating, B. Vitality, 150, rating, C. Overall Challenge rating, B. Note, entity has been recognized as a shifter. Their stats may vary when transformed. Ermo's eyes widened in astonishment as he saw the floating text. What in the world is that? Sera methodically scanned the words without turning her gaze. I've integrated you with the spirit tree, which means you can see the same words I see so long as you are connected. But, you won't be able to do anything, given that I am the administrator. Intrigued, Ermo reached out a hand towards the closest floating text. However, his hand phased through the words as if it went through air. Didn't know the spirit tree was so advanced. You'd be surprised at what it can do, though obviously it has seen better days. Right, and how long do you need me to stand around? A bit more, just try to relax for this next part. The roots entwined around Ermo's limbs sank into his flesh and merged with him. Though surprisingly, the beastkin didn't show any signs of discomfort. Shortly after, the roots ensnaring him started to emit a soft glow. But the light emanating from the roots soon diminished, and they reverted to their original state. A new words abruptly appeared in the air. Error, experience extraction failed, target is incompatible. Seeing this, Ermo raised an eyebrow. Is it supposed to say that? Sera shook her head. No, I just showed you that to prove a point. As you saw, the spirit tree wasn't able to feed from you because you are too far removed from a normal beastkin. Can the tree feed on normal beastkin only? Not just beastkin, anyone who the system recognized as part of the mortal races would do, like humans for example. I see, so the plan is to get adventurers to come into the dungeon and have them die so the spirit tree can grow. That's certainly one option, however, it's not one I'm keen on undertaking immediately. The spirit tree is in a fragile state, and I don't want to put it at risk until the dungeon is more developed. So, are we just going to kidnap people to feed the tree? That's one option out of many, almost anything is on the table at this point. If you're not comfortable with that, then it would be best for us to part ways now. Ermo's breaths quickened. Sweat beaded on his forehead, a testament to the intensity of his internal struggle. The weight of Sera's ultimatum bore down on him, causing his shoulders to slump under its invisible pressure. Meanwhile, Sera's demeanor subtly shifted. Her body tensed as the slightest hint of magic shimmered around her fingertips. Just a matter of time. The beastkin took a deep breath before he spoke. As long as I don't have to see anything too crazy, I'll look the other way. Sera's posture relaxed instantly, the tension melting from her body. Good, now follow me. Chapter 6 Lady of Flies. Sera walked across the desolate landscape with Ermo following close behind. The beastkin observed their surroundings with curiosity and wariness. What are we looking for exactly? He asked, ears twitching as he looked around. Sera squinted as she spotted a stone platform in the distance with a grey crystal hovering above it. There. The two approached the platform. Its weathered stone surface was edged with intricate runes that glowed faintly. The crystal above it hovered, spinning slowly and casting light on the ground below. Ermo stepped onto the platform and tapped it with his foot a few times. Is this supposed to do anything? Sera took a few measured steps back as she appraised the stone platform before her. This is a dungeon teleportation platform, a remnant of the former artificial core. Now, kindly step aside. I intend to make a few improvements. Ermo nodded and stepped off the platform and took one last curious glance at the structure. Sera, meanwhile, took a deep breath to center herself. She made a cut across both of her palms using the sharp end of her antlers, causing viscous sap to ooze from the wounds. The Elder Dryad knelt down and pressed both of her hands firmly against the barren soil. Instantly, black roots surged from her palms and burrowed into the ground. The roots coiled around the stone platform, causing cracks to spread across its surface. The roots continued to tighten their grip, squeezing with relentless force. Until finally, with a sharp, echoing snap, the crystal shattered into countless fragments that scattered across the platform. But Sera's roots weren't finished, they then continued to break down the stone platform until it was reduced to nothing more than rubble. As the last remnants of the platform crumbled away, the black roots slithered back into the earth and left the ground bare. Sera stood up as the black tendrils receded back into her palms and dissolved into her skin. The wounds on her hands knitted together seamlessly, healing in mere seconds. Now, we wait. For a good while, nothing happened. Ermo glanced around, brow furrowing in confusion. Sorry, but, am I missing something here? Sera shot a sharp glare towards the beastkin. Just wait. Gradually, the ground beneath them crumbled, the vibrations subtle at first but steadily growing in intensity. Until suddenly, a brilliant green magic circle manifested on the ground where the platform once stood. Intricate runes pulsed with vibrant light, casting an ethereal glow across the space. The patterns spread outward from the center and waved together to form a web of glowing vines and leaves. A silver-leafed flower grew rapidly in the middle of the circle. Its stem shot upward, twisting gracefully as it reached for the sky. The flower soon stood as tall as one's hips, its petals unfurling with a silvery glow. Ermo stared at the scene. What is this thing? Stop asking questions and just follow me. Sera scoffed. She stepped onto the magic circle, the glowing runes illuminating her path. Ermo hesitated for a moment, then followed her lead and stepped onto the platform with slight reluctance. Soon, roots emerged from the ground, wrapping tightly around Ermo's legs. A detached, monotone voice echoed through the chamber. Welcome, new user. The dungeon is currently in an inactive state. Please wait until further notice. Ermo tensed, but before he could react further, a similar set of roots enveloped Sera. The voice spoke again, this time with a different message. Welcome, Administrator, unlocking all dungeon permissions now. Can you take us to the next floor? Sera asked. This action can be completed, but further movement beyond the next floor is restricted due to lack of data. That's fine, take us there. Sera said. With that command, the magic circle beneath them glowed intensely. The air around them crackled with energy, the humming sound growing louder as the light intensified. Only moments later, Sera and Ermo found themselves standing on a similar magic circle, its glowing runes fading into the darkness around them. Yet, the air was much cooler, carrying a damp chill that clung to their skin. The only light came from the sparse remnants of torches lining the walls. Most were dark and lifeless, their metal sconces cold to the touch. Sera approached one of the torches, fingers brushing over the frigid surface. Recently extinguished monotorches, likely sapped of their strength since I destroyed the original dungeon core. Ermo looked around, his eyes darting from shadow to shadow. Where are we? Sera's gaze swept over the shadowed corridors. We're on a new floor of the dungeon. This one appears to be some kind of maze. Ermo's eyes narrowed, his muscles tensing instinctively. I don't like this place, something doesn't feel right. Just stay close to me and keep calm. They moved cautiously through the maze, the echoes of their footsteps the only sound in the eerie silence. The walls were close, and the path often narrowed, forcing them to walk single file. Sera led the way, occasionally touching the walls, feeling for any hidden traps or clues. After what felt like hours, they reached a particularly narrow passageway. The walls seemed to close in, the rough stone brushing against Sera's shoulders as she squeezed through. She paused to check behind her to make sure that Ermo was still following. But she soon noticed how his footsteps were slower, and his breathing had grown noticeably heavier. You can't possibly be exhausted already. My bad, just tired. Sera stopped and turned to face the beastkin. We need to keep moving, but if you need a moment. Ermo's legs buckled first, his knees hitting the hard ground with a dull thud. His body followed, crumpling into a motionless heap as if every ounce of strength had been sapped away in an instant. Yet, Sera didn't rush to his side as her senses prickled with awareness, attuned to the faintest of disturbances in the air. Her gaze shifted as she looked throughout the labyrinth's darkened recesses. A tiny movement caught her attention, something moving against Ermo's neck. She spotted a fly there, its wings catching the faint light in iridescent patterns. This insect is abnormal, born from magic rather than from biology. As Sera took a slow step forward, the fly sensed her approach and took flight, vanishing deeper into the maze. When she knelt down to check on Ermo, she saw the lingering traces of magic on him like wisps hovering in the air. Demonic magic, very refined too. Its wielder must no doubt be very capable. Sera rose to her feet, but as she pivoted, her eyes caught the fluttering movement of another fly rounding the corner before it darted away into the shadows. Her gaze sharpened as she realized that she was likely being watched or possibly tracked. For now, she grasped Ermo by the shoulders and dragged him to a secluded corner. She positioned him carefully, ensuring he was well hidden behind a protruding section of the wall. Her fingers brushed against his neck, feeling for the steady rise and fall of his breath. Satisfied that he was still breathing steadily, she took a moment to gather her thoughts. The intruder is nearby. She moved back through the maze quietly. Her fingers brushed against the rough stone, feeling the vibrations of the labyrinth around her. Suddenly, Sera stopped as she heard the sound of armored boots striking the ground, accompanied by the murmur of voices. She pressed herself against the wall and listened intently as the sounds became more clear. Madame Zoha, isn't there a chance that the dungeon core just hasn't fully set in yet? A masculine voice said. And there's no way anyone else but us knows about this dungeon anyway, it's too new, another voice added. Quiet down, there are other people here with us, a feminine voice spoke, her tone sharp and commanding. Sera moved closer to the wall, seeing the faint light of torchlight growing brighter. She made a cut on her palm using the sharp end of her antlers as she inched herself closer, preparing for an inevitable confrontation. The second she sensed that the group was close, Sera turned from the corner and unleashed dark tendrils from her palm. Each one shot out with deadly precision, impaling straight through the chests of the armored men in front of her. Their eyes widened in shock before the light faded from them as they collapsed to the ground. While her tendrils retracted into her palm, Sera walked forward and observed the corpses with a scrutinizing gaze. The armored men lay sprawled on the cold stone floor, their lifeless eyes staring blankly into nothingness. Sera knelt beside one of the fallen men, fingers brushing against the cold metal of his armor. She felt the rough texture of the chainmail beneath her fingertips to confirm its solidity. Then, she kicked a few of the bodies, their weight shifting with a sickening thud, but none of them flickered or dissolved. The bodies were real, their blood staining her feet as she moved. These are not illusions. Suddenly, the sound of footsteps echoed behind her, breaking the silence. Sera's head whipped around, her senses on high alert, as a figure emerged from the shadows. The woman was shrouded in a black hooded cloak that draped over her entire body, blending seamlessly with the darkness. White-colored bandages wrapped around her from head to toe, leaving only her face and part of her upper neck exposed. Her face was pale and almost ghostly, the skin so white it looked almost as if it were glowing faintly in the dim light. Her eyes were the most unnerving feature, hollow, pupil-less voids that stared unblinkingly. They were like bottomless pits, devoid of emotion or life. Sera's fingers twitched, ready to summon her tendrils again if necessary. This one is dangerous, I need to plan my next moves as carefully as I can. The woman's lips stretched into an unsettlingly wide smile. I never expected that my next meal would be this delicious. Your arrogance truly astounds me, demon. It is not arrogance, just confidence. The demoness charged towards Sera, her movements a blur of speed and aggression. In the blink of an eye, she closed the gap. The Elder Dryad barely had time to react before a searing pain shot through her. She gasped as she felt her arm being ripped off, sending pain coursing through her body. Yet, Sera still managed to turn around and spotted the demoness, who had already started eating her arm with grotesque delight. The demoness bit into the flesh with razor-sharp teeth, black sap dribbling down her chin. Her eyes glinted with a sadistic pleasure as she consumed her prize. Seeing this, Sera managed a smile despite the pain. Looks like it's my victory. Black tendrils sprouted from the arm the demoness was eating, emerging swiftly and sinuously like serpents awakened from a deep slumber. They coiled around her body with astonishing speed, each tendril winding tighter and tighter as they wrapped around her torso, limbs, and neck. The more she fought, the tighter the tendrils squeezed. Yet, suddenly, the room was filled with the sound of countless flies buzzing as the demoness' body collapsed into a swarm of flies. They then converged into a space nearby, coalescing into a single, grotesque form. Gradually, the demoness reformed into her true appearance. The first part of her body to reform was her hair, each strand shifting from a dark shadow to a bright, silken white, falling to her shoulders in a cascading wave. Her eyes were next, followed by her limbs which were segmented and insectal. Each one covered in a pristine white carapace that glistened like polished ivory. Large, black wings emerged from her back, the thin membranes between the veins shimmering faintly. The wings buzzed softly, emitting a low hum that resonated through the air. The ornate black dress she wore appeared as if it were woven from the finest silk threads. The fabric flowed over her body with intricate patterns that appeared almost alive, shifting and changing with each movement. The demoness stood before Sera with a cruel smile playing at the corners of her lips. You are resilient, I'll give you that. Black tendrils sprouted from the torn stump of Sera's arm, weaving together to reform the muscles that formed the arms before pale skin seamlessly covered the new limb. I could say the same for you. The demoness paced around lightly, segmented limbs moving with an eerie grace. What are you really? I thought you were some new breed of elf at first, but that doesn't seem right. Sera stood completely still, her eyes tracking the demoness' every movement. I am what I am. The demoness shook her head. So be it. With a sudden motion, she vanished into a cloud of flies that dispersed throughout the area, filling the air with a frenzied buzzing. Immediately, Sera closed her eyes, focusing intently to sense the demoness' presence among the chaotic swarm. With her senses heightened, she could feel even the faintest disturbances in the air. Eventually, she pivoted on her heel and spat out a seed into what initially looked like empty space. The seed bumped into something mid-air and instantly sprouted into a series of silver-thorned vines. The vines grew rapidly, twisting and curling as they wrapped around an invisible form. The demoness reappeared in the middle of the vines, her hollow eyes wide with anger. She gritted her teeth as the vines constricted around her, the sharp thorns digging into her segmented exoskeleton. The demoness struggled, wings flapping furiously. What in the world are these vines made out of? Sera took a few steps closer to the demoness. Pure nature magic, perfect for containing beings made from magic such as yourself. You're a dryad. And you are a fool. Sera then knelt down on one knee. However, since I'm feeling generous, I'll give you two choices, die the most painful death you can imagine, or serve me. The demoness' reaction was immediate and visceral. Her hollow eyes widened in stark terror, darting frantically as if searching for an escape that didn't exist. Her segmented fingers trembled, the joints clicking softly in her panic. I will serve you, mistress. A wise decision. Sera stood up and made a deeper cut across her palm using her antlers. She then drizzled the thick, black blood around the demoness's body in a precise circle. With her other hand, she dipped her fingers into the black sap from her wounded hand and drew intricate runes and sigils around the ritual circle. Once the ritual circle was finished, Sera stood up as the wound on her hand healed rapidly. "We are going to formalize our partnership with a contract, but first, tell me your name." The demoness nodded meekly. "Zoha. And your true name?" Zoha hesitated. She glanced around, as if the shadows might offer some form of escape. Her wings twitched, the faint buzzing a whisper of her internal conflict. Sera's foot tapped impatiently against the cold stone floor, the sound sharp and echoing in the silence. "Your true name, now." "It's Zohalin Theriel." "Good. Now, we can begin." Sera stepped just outside the ritual circle and lifted her hand, a soft glow emanating from her fingertips as she traced an invisible line in the air. "The following stipulations constitute the terms of our contract. First, you are to conduct yourself in a manner that unwaveringly aligns with my best interests." As she continued, Sera paced slowly around the perimeter of the circle. "Second," she said, pausing to look directly at Zoha, "you are expressly forbidden from intentionally causing harm to any entity or object that I deem valuable, unless explicitly instructed otherwise by myself." She stopped and turned to face Zoha fully. "Lastly," Sera declared, extending her arm towards Zoha, palm up, "you shall obey and execute any command or directive issued by me, irrespective of the potential harm it may inflict upon you. Now, Zohalin Theriel, do you accept these terms?" Zoha hesitated again, causing Sera to tighten the hold of the vines, the thorns digging deeper into the demoness's segmented limbs. "Why yes." Sera clasped her hands together. "I, Sera, scion of the spirit tree, bind you, Zohalin Theriel, to this contract. You are to serve me faithfully and without question, for as long as I deem necessary. By my will, this contract is sealed." The ritual circle glowed brightly as its radiant energy seeped into Zoha's body. The light mended every injury she had sustained. Cuts closed, bruises faded, and her strength returned. As the ritual reached its climax, the vines that had held the demoness in place loosened. They retracted slowly, releasing their grip and sliding back into the ground. The sigils and runes etched into the circle flared with one final burst of light before burning themselves into her carapace. Zoha stood still for a moment, her body pulsing with the remnants of the ritual's magic. She looked down at the marks on her skin, tracing the faint lines with awe. The ritual was complete, and the binding contract was now a part of her very being. The demoness slowly got up and bowed her head deeply. "I'm at your service, mistress." Sera turned her back on the demoness, her gaze fixed ahead. "Grab your belongings, afterwards, follow me." Sera and Zoha stood inside the spirit tree's chamber. The air was thick with the earthy scent of damp soil and the faint, sweet aroma of the silvery leaves. Zoha knelt down, her fingers trembling slightly as she tentatively touched the sapling's leaves. The leaves glowed softly under her touch, their delicate edges catching the light and reflecting it like tiny mirrors. "Is this really the spirit tree, mistress?" Sera nodded as she stepped closer. "Unfortunately, that will be its state for the foreseeable future. You will be helping me in aiding its growth, Zoha." The demoness stood up and bowed her head. "I'll do my best, mistress." Sera glanced at Ermo, who was sitting slumped against the wall, his chest rising and falling with slow, labored breaths. "Before that, what exactly did you do to him?" "The beastkin? I injected him with venom, nothing lethal though. He should return to consciousness sooner or later. Shall I wake him now?" "Leave him be for now. I wanted to ask you a few questions regardless." "Of course, mistress, what would you like to know?" "First of all, where is this dungeon located?" "The dungeon is located within the kingdom of Lizaria, roughly around the outskirts." Sera glanced at the neatly folded pile of clothes, bandages, and a small leather satchel behind Zoha. The items were arranged with meticulous care, the bandages wrapped tightly and the cloak draped smoothly over the bag. "I take it the bandages and cloak were part of your disguise?" Zoha nodded. "They are. I've actually been living amongst humans for a long time. The disguise allowed me to move freely, to gather information and resources without raising suspicion." "Did nobody ask questions about your eyes? Or why your body needed to be covered in bandages?" "Actually, it wasn't that difficult to convince the humans that I had a rare illness. Besides, I rarely venture out during the day and always avoid crowded places." "And why did you disguise yourself as an adventurer? It's quite the useful profession." If you're high-ranking enough, people won't question you as much. And if you lose a party member or two during a difficult mission, it can all be chalked up to unfortunate circumstances. Were those men with you part of your adventuring party? No, mistress, they were hired mercenaries I had planned on eating eventually. Were there any other mercenaries that came with you? I had a few more on standby on the first floor. Excellent, Sera said, her lips curling into a slight smile. Bring them in the ones I killed here, then return to standby on the first floor. Zoha bowed her head in acknowledgement. As you command, mistress. Chapter 7 Earth Shaper. Thanks to Zoha's assistance, Sera had gathered 12 humans and brought them back to the chamber of the spirit tree. Most were dead, but a few were just unconscious, their chests rising and falling with shallow breaths. All were now bound by vines conjured by Sera, and all would be of use to the tree's growth. Meanwhile, Ermo was still unconscious, slumped on a corner in the room. Sera could have chosen to wake him up, but she figured that the beastkin would come to his senses soon. Sera positioned herself with her back against the spirit tree. She closed her eyes, and soon, she could feel the cool, probing roots of the tree burrowing into her back. Displaying dungeon status. Core rank, 1. Core experience, 0. Dungeon boss, Sera. Number of floors, 3. Mana, 100/100. Monsters, 2. It was good to see that the system had updated its parameters. Though Sera did note that it had registered the dungeon as having 3 floors instead of 2, despite the fact that she had never set foot on the uppermost floor yet. It seems just my awareness of a floor existing in a dungeon was sufficient for the system to register its existence. Sera took one last look at the 12 men bound by her vines. And then, she clenched her hand into a fist. The sound of consecutive snaps echoed loudly through the air. In an instant, the 4 men who were unconscious had their necks snapped as their heads dropped low. Experience extraction initiated. The room fell silent as the spirit tree's thin roots slithered across the floor, reaching the lifeless bodies of the 12 men. With a slow, almost methodical precision, the roots punctured the flesh of the fallen soldiers to start extracting their blood. The red fluid traversed through the roots, weaving its way back toward the spirit tree's sapling. Given the thinness of the roots, Sera knew this process would take quite some time. Each droplet of life was precious, and the tree drank as fast as it could, which for now, was rather slow. Until suddenly, Sera's senses picked up on a familiar presence moving. She turned slightly, a slight smile breaking her otherwise stern demeanor. Ah, you're awake. Ermo clutched his head with a pained expression as he staggered toward her. Fuck me. I feel like I can't remember shit from the last hour or two. Sera lifted a hand to warn him. Careful, don't step on the food. Ermo tilted his head, confused. What fu? His question cut off abruptly as he saw the dead soldiers behind Sera. He gasped as he took in the sight of the dead men with roots extracting their blood. He pointed down to the bodies with a trembling finger as he carefully stepped aside. Anything you want to tell me, boss? Sera crossed her arms and turned her attention back to the extraction process. No, but if you feel queasy, you're welcome to leave. Ermo paced around the corpses, his eyes tracing the path of the roots as they snaked back to the spirit tree. Is this how the tree's going to grow? I already told you it needs to feed on mortals. Didn't think it would be like this. Thought the spirit tree would just make the people disappear. The humans will disappear, but it will take time. Until then, you're welcome to either stay and watch or get out. Yet. I'll just sit down. While the spirit tree's roots continued their work, Ermo settled down on the cold floor, leaning his back against the rough stone wall. Observing him, Sera noted the subtle shift in his demeanor. Though he was initially uncomfortable, the beastkin now watched the proceedings with what seemed like a morbid curiosity. She could almost see him acclimating as horror turned to a fascinated acceptance. As time passed, the bodies of the soldiers gradually became desiccated husks. Their skin puckered and shrank, clinging tightly to now brittle bones. Slowly, a subtle glow emerged from the corpses, a bluish light that grew brighter by the second. The light soon consumed the slain soldiers' bodies completely, turning them into motes of blue mana that scattered and dissipated through the air. The spirit tree absorbed the last traces of their essence, its leaves rustling softly. Finally, the process reached its conclusion, and words flashed before Sera's eyes. Experience extraction complete. Core experience updated to 1200. Rank up requirement from rank 1 to rank 2, 1000 experience. Initiate rank up sequence? The decision was obvious. Not like I can do much with a rank 1 dungeon core anyway. Rank up sequence initiated, please wait. The sapling's leaves glowed as each leaf pulsated, emitting gentle waves of energy. With each pulse, the spirit tree inched ever so slightly taller. Watching this, Sera felt a warm sensation beginning to simmer in her veins. It was subtle at first, but as the spirit tree continued to grow, the warmth spread and intensified. She could feel power coursing back into her and strengthening her connection with the tree. Rank up sequence complete. Displaying dungeon status. Core rank, 2. Core experience, 200. Dungeon boss, Sera. Number of floors, 3. Mana, 200/200. Monsters, 2. New feature unlocked, floor terrain alteration. Sera noted how the system only registered 2 monsters as being in the dungeon despite Zoha's presence. It seems that the system only recognizes monsters it has registered properly. Yet, unlocking floor terrain alteration gave Sera a bit of pause. Though her memory was quite fragmented, she still recalled how floor terrain options scaled with the rank of the dungeon core, meaning, a low-rank dungeon core would have little to no options to choose from. Initiating floor terrain alteration. Please select which number floor you wish to alter. You are currently on the 3rd floor of the dungeon. If there was any floor that needed an upgrade, the one hosting the spirit tree was definitely a priority. This floor should be Sera's stronghold, a place where she could feel secure. The 3rd floor has been chosen as the target of terrain alteration. Please review the available terrain options below. 1 basic theme, default option, unique passive, none. 2 stone maze, rank 2 option, unique passive, minor bonus to adventurer's fear. 3 mystic forest, unlocked due to administrator access, unique passive, significant boost to the effectiveness of nature magic, restriction, this terrain can only be applied to 1 floor. Given the limited options available, there was only one that Sera wanted. Mystic forest selected. Initiating terrain alteration. As Sera confirmed her choice, the chamber suddenly trembled. The vibrations grew quickly into a violent shaking, sending small bits of stone falling from the ceiling as dust filled the air. Ermo instinctively covered his head with his arms and ducked low to the ground, while Sera braced herself against a nearby wall. Then, just as quickly as it had begun, the shaking ceased. The last few stones clattered to the floor, and silence fell over the room. Ermo slowly lowered his hands, looking confused as he glanced around the now still chamber. What was that? Terrain alteration, things will look very different outside. Sera then glanced back at the display of words that had appeared in the air before her. Terrain alteration complete. For a moment, Sera considered altering the terrain of the 1st floor, but she decided to delay that until after she'd actually seen what layout the floor had with her own eyes. With that settled, it was time to finally test out monster creation. Displaying monster unlock options. 1 unlock 1 random F-tier monster, cost, 100 core experience. Unlock 1 random F-tier monster selected. Processing request. Though F-tier monsters were weak, they weren't useless. Getting a slime wouldn't be ideal, a goblin or kobold could be somewhat decent if I can make them fall in line. Hopefully I won't be stuck with anything that's too pathetic. New monster unlocked, Thornling. Level range, 15 to 25. Maintenance cost, 10 mana. Respawn time, 30 minutes. Description: Thornlings are small beings made of tangled thorny vines. They have red eyes and they move by slithering along the ground. Their touch is prickly, and they can entangle foes with their vine-like limbs. Sera was somewhat satisfied with unlocking Thornlings. They seemed capable enough for how cheap they were to maintain. Now it was only a matter of how many of them she wanted to spawn. She could spawn up to 20 of them at the moment, unless she wanted to unlock another F-tier monster and spawn them at the cost of 100 core experience and some more mana. After some consideration, she decided to just maximize the amount of Thornlings instead and refrain from unlocking another monster. The distinction between various F-tier monsters is likely negligible regardless. Where do you wish to spawn in the Thornlings? This floor please. Sera said out loud. How many do you wish to spawn? 20. Initiating Thornling spawn sequence. Spawning will occur at random locations within the designated floors. Now there was just one last thing that Sera wanted to check. It was time to access her own profile. Hopefully, something has improved this time. Name, Sera. Species, Elder Dryad. Access Privilege, Administrator. Level, 300. Magic, 300, Rating, S. Magic Resistance, 300, Rating, S. Physical Defense, 100, Rating, C. Strength, 50, Rating, E. Speed, 150, Rating, B. Vitality, 300, Rating, S. Overall Challenge Rating, S. Alert, Path Selection now available. And there it was, the opportunity of a lifetime. Sera could finally regain a semblance of the power that she should have had all along. I had always felt that something was missing in me all this time, perhaps this will resolve that issue. Warning, once a path has been selected, the user must continue to grow in that path until all features in it have been unlocked. Additionally, once a path has been completed, the user can only select the next closest path following this order: spring, summer, autumn, winter. From what Sera gathered, if she were to hypothetically select summer, then once she's unlocked everything in that path, she'll have to progress through autumn next. This is definitely not a choice I can make lightly. Displaying path descriptions. Spring, gain abilities related to healing and support. Summer, gain abilities related to destruction and fire. Autumn, gain abilities related to decay and infestation. Winter, gain abilities related to frost and preservation. Sera assumed that spring would enhance her capability to buff and heal any allied monsters she encounters. Not a bad choice, but Sera knew that she didn't exactly have many monsters that she'd need to support for now. Summer was interesting. Offensive magic is always a powerful tool, though Sera feared that the abilities given by this path would be akin to giving her a sledgehammer rather than something with more finesse. Autumn seemed like it could give her offense as well. Although she wasn't quite sure what powers infestation would actually entail. Last but not least was winter. This one was also a tempting option, as preservation of any kind likely meant creating barriers or preventing damage, something that Sera was keen to do for herself and the spirit tree. She figured that frost probably meant ice magic, which would be a decent bonus all things considered. Sera thought one last time before she made her choice. Every single path has its merits, and I should eventually unlock every single one. The only question is what order would make the most sense given my current position. After some careful deliberation, Sera mentally ranked each of the paths, in order from least important to most important. She only had a vague idea of what each path was capable of, but she tried her best to make the best out of the information she had. Summer ranked as the least important overall. Offensive power is nice, but brute strength won't help me with solving problems that require more unique capabilities. Next was autumn, more so because Sera wasn't sure what type of abilities decay and infestation referred to exactly. Maybe if the other paths were less appealing I would have chosen this first out of curiosity. Spring sounded very valuable, but likely not ideal in the immediate future as Sera didn't have many allied monsters to support yet. The spring path's value will likely increase when I amass more of an army in the future. Sera ranked winter as the most valuable overall because not only did it sound like it could have a balance of offensive and defensive capabilities, it also allowed her to access the spring path immediately after. I'm convinced the frost will involve some kind of ice magic, perhaps preservation will involve creating shields or barriers. Winter path selected. New ability unlocked, Frost Touch. Description: the user can freeze objects and creatures that they touch. Restriction: the user can only activate Frost Touch by first making contact with a solid or liquid surface, and the freezing effect is limited to what they can touch directly with their hands. Additionally, this ability does not extend to freezing air or intangible substances. Sera carefully detached herself from the roots that had been ingrained into her back, feeling the slight pull as each tendril released its grip. She stood still for a moment and flexed her fingers as she felt the stir of new power within. It's time to do a small test. She reached out and placed her hand against the wall of the chamber, focusing her intent on channeling the essence of frost. Almost instantly, ice formed and spread rapidly across the surface of the stone. The wall frosted over, glistening as a chill emanated from her touch. She pulled her hand back and turned her head to find Ermo watching, his eyes wide with astonishment. "You can freeze things now, boss." Sera nodded, a slight smile crossing her face. "It would appear so, but there is one more thing to test, just in case." She lifted her hand to her antlers and used the sharp end to make a small cut on her palm. As the black sap leaked from the wound, she focused her energy and aimed her palm at an empty spot on the wall. Black tendrils burst out from her palm, writhing as they reached out and touched the wall. Sera tried to channel her frost through the tendrils, willing the chill to flow from her body into the dark extensions. But despite her efforts, nothing happened. A bit unfortunate that my tendrils don't count towards frost touch, but at least now I know for certain. With a sigh, Sera retracted the tendrils, letting them draw back into her palm. As she did, her wounds began to heal, the black sap ceasing to flow. She clenched her hand into a fist, feeling the skin knit back together seamlessly. I'm good now, we're leaving. With a renewed sense of purpose, she walked toward the exit of the room. Ermo, not wanting to be left behind, quickly moved to follow her. As they approached the entwined roots that sealed the entrance, Sera raised her hand. She felt an unexpected lightness, a clarity that made her magic flow more freely than before. With a thought, the roots responded and parted smoothly to clear the path. Stepping out into the open, Sera was first struck by how heightened the magic she felt was, pulsing from the ground to the highest leaves. Tall trees with trunks that twisted into the sky filled the area. Their leaves were suffused with a noticeable glow, flickering gently under the bright blue sky. The ground beneath her feet was covered by a lush tapestry of vibrant green moss, so rich it seemed imbued with life, springing back with every step she took. All while parts of the area were covered in light fog that weaved a path between trees and underbrush. While Sera stepped further into the forest, the trees and bushes parted to clear a path as if bending in silent homage. She paused and glanced back at Ermo, who stood transfixed. Don't just stand there, walk. The beastkin shook his head, as if waking from a trance. Right, my bad. Sera sighed softly and resumed her walk. Look out for the thornlings if you see them, they're the only other monsters here so you can't mistake them. They continued their trek for a time and things were mostly quiet barring the natural ambience. Until suddenly, Sera heard the sound of rustling leaves followed by a pained fuck. Turning around, Sera couldn't help but chuckle. A thornling had latched onto Ermo's arm. The creature was small but fierce, with spiky tendrils covered in sharp barbs that gleamed under the glow of the forest's enchanted leaves. Its body was a mix of light and dark green for the most part, save for the vivid red tips of its thorns that now dug stubbornly into Ermo's arm. The beastkin frantically tried to shake the thornling off, but the creature clung on with a stubborn tenacity. Let go of me, you little piece of... Meanwhile, Sera pointed towards a rustling in the underbrush where 19 other thornlings were advancing towards them. You might want to reconsider your attitude. Seeing the group of thornlings approaching, Ermo's expression shifted from anger to concern, and he quickly walked to Sera with a pleading look. Boss, please, you have to get this thing off of me. Sera turned her gaze to the thornling clinging to Ermo's arm. Almost as if responding to an unspoken command, the small creature released its hold and dropped to the ground with a soft thud. Its glowing red eyes shifted from Ermo and looked up at Sera expectantly. In fact, as if following the lead of their companion, the rest of the thornlings halted their advance and rearranged themselves into a rough rectangular formation in front of Sera. Each creature stood still, their bright eyes fixed on her. Sera knelt down and extended her hand towards one of the thornlings, touching it gently at the base of one of its sharp thorns. The little creature responded positively to her touch and emitted a soft sound akin to a cat's purr. All right, I think those things just hate me. No, they didn't register you as friendly yet. But that's an easy fix. Sera stood up and turned to face the thornlings directly, then pointed a hand towards Ermo. Listen carefully, little ones, this beastkin is friendly, understood? In response, all of the thornlings nodded simultaneously. Their glowing red eyes briefly flickering as if to signal their comprehension. Satisfied with their response, Sera then gestured towards the deeper parts of the forest. Now go and patrol the area. The thornlings quickly paired up and scuttled away towards various directions. Seeing this, Ermo scratched the back of his head. Guess you were right after all. Of course, I always am. Chapter 8 Misery. Sera and Ermo stepped out of the teleportation circle and into the uppermost floor of the dungeon. The area they entered was stark and barren. The floor was scattered with the occasional remnants of old camp materials, a charred fire pit surrounded by half-burnt logs, a few abandoned bedrolls, and some dirty cooking utensils. Sera glanced around the space before she turned her attention to the teleportation circle behind them. The runes and symbols glowed faintly, their energy pulsating in response to her presence. She extended a hand, fingers tracing patterns in the air as she spoke softly. Welcome any tributes who arrive and grant them passage to the subsequent floor autonomously. Ensure they cannot skip any floors. Command acknowledged. Access restrictions implemented. Ermo furrowed his brow in confusion. What was that for? I'm ensuring that anyone who enters this dungeon cannot just bypass all the floors immediately. They will have to navigate each floor, one by one. This will allow us to monitor and control who progresses, and allow me to control the progression of future tributes. Did you mean adventurers, boss? I said what I said. The two kept walking, their footsteps echoing softly through the empty chamber. Eventually, they were approached by Zoha, who had returned to her disguised self. The demoness's body was once again covered in meticulously wrapped bandages, concealing the insectal form beneath. Her black hooded cloak cast a deep shadow over her face, making her hollow, pupil-less eyes even more haunting. Zoha greeted Sera with a polite bow. Greetings, mistress. Ermo involuntarily grimaced. Hey, wait a minute, aren't you the bitch who put me to sleep? Zoha looked at the beastkin with a blank expression, but soon bowed her head slightly. My sincere apologies. Ermo clenches his fists in anger. Oh yeah? I'll show you what. Sera stepped in between the two. Enough, she said sharply. There are more important things for us to do. The beastkin relaxed slightly, though his arms remained crossed. Whatever you say, boss. Sera then turned her attention to Zoha. Tell me, are there any settlements nearby? Villages? Towns? There are a few small villages and the city of Marwood within a day's journey from here. A city only a day's journey away from here? Humans must have no more fear over dungeons. It's how things are, mistress. Adventurers are managed under the Adventurers Guild and send people into dungeons every week. Do people no longer die in these dungeons? Some still do, but the vast majority of people expect to come out alive. Sera rubbed her temples, a wave of frustration washing over her. Things are worse than I imagined. Zoha's hands were clasped tightly in front of her, the fingers interwoven in a gesture of subservience. My sympathies, mistress. Sera waved a hand dismissively. Never mind that. She then pointed to Ermo, her gaze narrowing with curiosity. What about him? Are beastkin shifters always stationed in dungeons now? Not always, but very rarely, a dungeon will have an enraged beastkin shifter placed at its bottommost floor to protect the core. Ermo sighed, shoulders slumping slightly. Seriously? I was kidnapped and tortured just to be a glorified guard dog. Sera shot a surprised look at him. You weren't aware? Nope, just got taken away one day. Didn't know I could transform either. I see, that is most unfortunate. Sera then turned to Zoha. I'm now very curious about what life is like for humans in current times. Can you guide me to Marwood? Of course, mistress. Sera turned to Ermo, her expression softening as she addressed him. Ermo, I shall require you to remain within the dungeon while Zoha and I explore Marwood. Ermo's ears perked up slightly. Got it. And if you don't mind, could I chop some wood and gather materials while you're gone? I'd like to make some tools and maybe build something for myself. Sera considered his request. She didn't see many negatives in granting the beastkin a little leeway given his position. He has nowhere else to go, I doubt he will do anything rash. Very well, you are free to do as you wish, provided you remain within the confines of the dungeon. Sera said. Ermo's face lit up with gratitude, his tail giving a small twitch. Thanks, boss. How long do you think you'll be away? It depends, maybe a few days depending on the travel distance. We could take the path through Whispering Woods. From there, we can follow the old trader's road that will take us to the outskirts of Marwood. Zoha said. Sera raised an eyebrow. Is that the best route to Marwood? Zoha inclined her head slightly, maintaining a respectful demeanor. Yes, mistress. It is the standard and safest way to reach Marwood. Before Sera could respond, Ermo's voice cut through the air. Why not just teleport to Marwood? I've seen the teleportation circles in the dungeon, so why can't we use the same method to get there? Sera turned her gaze to the beastkin. The dungeon teleportation circles are special, created directly by the spirit tree. Making a teleportation circle from scratch is something that is outside of my capabilities for the time being. Zoha's eyes flickered with irritation as she addressed Ermo. She crossed her arms over her chest, fingers tapping lightly against her forearm. Teleportation magic isn't as simple as you think. Ermo's expression hardened as he squared his shoulders. Well, if you're so smart, why don't you figure out a better way to get to Marwood? I would if I could. Zoha said. At that moment, Sera looked at the demoness with great suspicion. She observed the subtle rigidity in Zoha's overly practiced movements, the way her hands moved with rehearsed elegance. The mask of innocence that she wore was almost too perfect, too polished to be genuine. She took a step closer towards the demoness. Zoha, do you know of a faster way to get to Marwood? Mistress, the route I mentioned before is one of the safest and fastest ways to get to the city. I believe you, however, my question was whether you are actually able to get me there faster. Should you keep trying to lie, there will be consequences. Mistress, I don't. Before Zoha could finish, a sharp pain pierced through her body and caused her to wince. Her knees buckled under the sudden agony as she collapsed to the ground. Her hands instinctively clutched her sides as pain spread through her body like wildfire. What's happening to her? Ermo asked. Sera shot an indifferent glance at the demoness while she writhed on the ground. Zoha went too far in trying to break the terms of the contract. She wasn't technically lying when she mentioned the safer route earlier, so I changed my question accordingly. Ermo chuckled as he watched Zoha writhe in pain. Serves her right. The demoness breathed heavily as she slowly got herself up. Zoha's eyes then flicked toward Ermo, narrowing into a venomous glare. Her lips parted as she was about to hurl an insult, but Sera's icy glare silenced her instantly. Zoha instead forced a sheepish smile. My apologies, mistress. Do you really think that a mere apology is enough to pay for your transgression? Of course, not. If there is anything I can do to make things up to you, please let me know. Give me one of your arms, I don't care which. Mistress, you can't be serious, right? Don't make me repeat myself. But Before she could finish her sentence, Zoha collapsed to the ground as her body was hit with excruciating pain. She convulsed violently, purple blood splattering from her lips with each shuddering cough. Her body twisted and writhed as every muscle seized uncontrollably. Ermo knelt beside her and reached out with a hesitant hand. Hold on, let me. Zoha's eyes blazed with fury even as her body betrayed her, and she swatted his hand away with surprising strength. I don't need your help. Ermo shrugged and backed off. Suit yourself. The demoness took a deep breath as she forced herself into a sitting position. Then, she tore her arm from her body, the sound of tearing flesh and snapping sinew echoing through the chamber. Purple blood oozed from the wound as her face contorted in agony. She presented the severed limb to Sera and bowed her head down. Please forgive me, mistress. You've earned my forgiveness, this time. I understand. Sera knelt down and approached Zoha, her expression softening slightly. She placed her hand over the demoness' side. Hold still. Soon, a green light emanated from Sera's palm and enveloped the jagged stump of Zoha's torn arm. As the light pulsed, the raw wound closed and pale flesh started to regenerate, inching outward from the severed end. New skin formed to cover the flesh, spreading over the exposed muscles and sinews. As the flesh solidified, a familiar chitinous exoskeleton emerged. The exoskeleton grew outward and covered the newly formed hand. Segments appeared and interlocked with natural precision as her fingers finally took shape, the segments clicking into place with a near-mechanical rhythm. Zoha watched in awe as she felt the magic work through her body. When the light faded, she flexed her new insectal fingers. Thank you, mistress, she said with genuine gratitude as she stood up alongside Sera. Sera stood up and dusted her hands, a satisfied smile on her lips. We should leave for Marwood soon, she said aloud, her voice echoing in the barren chamber. Zoha, now standing beside her, glanced at Sera's antlers. Mistress, you will need a disguise. Your antlers will draw unwanted attention. Ermo nodded in agreement, though his expression was doubtful. She's right, boss. But I'm not sure how you are going to hide those antlers. Sera chuckled softly. I can manage a disguise just fine. She reached up and tapped her antlers one by one with her fingers. As her magic flowed through them, the antlers began to crack and splinter. The pieces fell to the ground, breaking off in chunks. The stumps receded back into her forehead, melting away and vanishing without a trace, leaving her brow smooth and unblemished. The second that the last antler disappeared, her black, shadowy dress shifted and warped. The fabric rippled like liquid before transforming into a hooded cloak that enveloped her. Sera pulled the hood over her head and looked at both Ermo and Zoha. How do I look? Zoha chuckled, putting a hand over her mouth. You look like a runaway elf princess, mistress. Ermo blushed slightly, scratching the back of his head. Yeah, what she said. But will people be suspicious if I look like this? Probably not, elves aren't too uncommon in Marwood. Ermo glanced at Sera's eyes, their piercing silver hue glowing faintly even in the dim light. What about your eyes, boss? They are quite noticeable. Sera turned to Zoha. What do you think? The demoness considered this for a moment before responding. Your eyes might draw some glances, but I doubt they'll cause too much suspicion. Most people will likely think it's just an exotic trait. Sera scrutinized Zoha, noting the twitch of her fingers before they relaxed. The demoness' steady, pupil-less eyes didn't appear to hold deceit, only calm confidence. Her posture was straight, shoulders squared, and chin slightly lifted in respect. Satisfied, Sera turned and started to walk. Good, we can finally leave. The three of them walked towards the dungeon's entrance, which was now an intricate weave of thick roots, intertwining and forming an almost organic gate. Zoha examined the entrance and touched it tentatively. Her fingers brushed against the roots, causing some of them to recede into the ground. This entrance isn't the same as when I came in. Sera stepped forward and touched the root-filled entrance, causing all the roots to recede to the ground all at once. The spirit tree must have made some improvements. The three of them walked past the dungeon's entrance, the thick roots parting smoothly to allow their passage. As they moved closer to the outside, the air grew warmer and filled with the earthy scent of the forest floor mingled with the fresh aroma of pine and wild flowers. Outside, the forest was bathed in the golden hues of the afternoon sun. Tall trees filled the area, leaves rustling softly in the gentle breeze. Ermo stretched his arms wide, his muscles rippling under his fur. He inhaled deeply, a contented smile spreading across his face. Feels good to smell fresh air again. Sera turned to Zoha. Now, tell me how you can take me to Marwood as fast as possible. I can use my flies to take us immediately to the city. And how many people can you bring using your flies at any given time? Ordinarily, just myself, but since I am contracted to you, mistress, the flies will be able to teleport you as well. Are there any other restrictions on this teleportation? My flies can lift objects but cannot teleport them unless either you or I are carrying or wearing them. Allow me to demonstrate. Zoha extended her hand as her swarm of flies emerged from beneath her sleeve. They moved with a synchronized elegance, circling around her wrist. The demoness then picked up a small, smooth stone from the ground and gently handed it to the swarm. The flies buzzed softly, lifting the stone effortlessly into the air. After a few seconds, the flies carefully lowered the stone back to the ground, placing it precisely where Zoha had picked it up. I see, now, show me the teleportation. Sera said. Zoha nodded and picked up the rock again, this time holding it in her open palm. In an instant, she and the rock dissolved into a cloud of flies. The swarm pulsated with energy, then vanished, leaving only a faint shimmer in the air. A few seconds later, the cloud of flies reappeared a bit further away. The swarm coalesced, reforming into Zoha, who stood with the rock still balanced on her palm. She opened her eyes and smiled slightly. Will that do, mistress? Sera nodded, clearly impressed. Indeed, that's enough. Now, can you take me to Marwood? Zoha inclined her head respectfully. Of course, please step closer to me. Sera moved closer to Zoha with a steady gaze. As she did, the swarm of flies rapidly gathered around them, enveloping them in a cocoon of darkness. For a few seconds, Sera couldn't see or feel anything. The world around her was silent, the only sensation being the emptiness that pressed in on all sides. But gradually, the sound of buzzing wings grew louder, filling her ears with their relentless hum. The noise crescendoed to a peak before vanishing all at once. When she opened her eyes, Sera found herself standing on the outskirts of Marwood, its skyline a mix of imposing stone structures and wooden buildings. The city walls were tall, but their surfaces were darkened with soot and grime. Smoke rose from numerous chimneys, which added to the putrid scent that carried on the wind. The surrounding landscape was equally uninviting. Sparse, scraggly trees dotted the barren fields that led up to the city gates. The ground was uneven and rocky, with patches of dry, yellowed grass struggling to survive in the harsh environment. Sera turned to Zoha, who was still busy dusting off her cloak. This is Marwood. Zoha nodded as she finished adjusting her clothes. Yes, we are currently just on the outskirts of the city. Truth be told, I had imagined something far less dreary. The war that the king started a few years ago took its toll on the city. Most of its men and women were sent out to fight. In addition, the war also disrupted the flow of trade, depleting the local government of valuable tax revenue. Sera chuckled. That explains why that foolish prince was only escorted by weaklings. Zoha's pupil-less eyes widened. Do you mean Prince Leo? Ah yes, him. If I recall correctly, he was sent on an expedition to destroy the last dungeon in existence. Was that your dungeon, mistress? It was, but before you say anything, let me ask you this. Do the humans know about Prince Leo's death? Nobody knows as far as I can tell. Besides, the royal family would want to keep the news hidden for a while regardless, even if they knew, in order to avoid panic. Sera felt a wave of satisfaction wash over her at the news. Prince Leo's death, still unknown to the humans, gave her an advantage she intended to exploit. She turned to Zoha with a slight smile. Guide me into the city proper, Zoha. The demoness nodded and began walking toward the city gates. Sera followed closely, her eyes scanning their surroundings with keen interest. As they approached, the line of people waiting to enter Marwood stretched out before them, a bustling stream of travelers, merchants, and townsfolk. The air buzzed with murmurs and the occasional clatter of hooves and wagon wheels. Yet, despite the length of the queue, it moved at a surprisingly brisk pace. Sera's sharp gaze quickly discerned the reason. The guards at the gate were turning away people fast. Out of the 20 to 30 people she saw so far, none were allowed inside. As she neared the gates, Sera's attention was drawn to a family just in front of them. A man and a woman, both with worn faces and tattered clothes, were on their knees, pleading with the guards. 2 young children clung to their mother, eyes wide with fear and exhaustion. Please, we just need shelter and food, the mother begged, her voice cracking with desperation. Our village was destroyed, we have nowhere else to go. The father joined in, clasping his hands. Please, we don't need much. Just a place to rest, some food for the children. We can work, earn our keep. I used to be a blacksmith. I can fix your armor, mend your weapons. My wife can help in the kitchens, or with cleaning, just give us a chance. The scarred guard's eyes narrowed with contempt. Heard all of that bullshit before. We don't have room for more mouths to feed. Move along. The father took another step forward. I beg you, sir. We have nowhere else to go. The children, they're hungry, and tired. We've been walking for days. Please, show some mercy. The guard's face hardened, his jaw tightening. Without saying anything else, he lashed out with a brutal shove. The force sent the father stumbling backward as he tried to regain his balance. He hit the ground hard, a pained grunt escaping his lips as dust billowed up around him. The mother cried as she pulled her children closer, fingers digging into their small shoulders protectively. The children huddled against her, visibly confused and fearful. Piss off, the guard spat. You think your begging will change anything? He took a step forward, towering over the father. Get up and get out of here before I make you regret staying. The father struggled to stand. His gaze casted down before he helped his wife to her feet, her sobs quieter now but still filled with the same desperation. The guards watched them leave with impassive expressions, as if they had grown numb to such scenes. While the family passed by, Sera turned to Zoha. Who were they? They were likely refugees, mistress. Where they came from is hard to say, but the war has displaced many. I see, and did Marwood take in any of these refugees? The city did take in a good amount during the start of the war, but most ended up living in the slums as they couldn't return to wherever they came from. Very interesting. Sera said out loud. Desperation often breeds opportunity. Hopefully, the circumstances within the city are even more dire. Eventually, it was Sera and Zoha's turn to approach the guards. Their demeanor shifted almost instantly as they recognized the demoness. Lady Zoha, one of them greeted, inclining his head respectfully. Back from another adventure, I see. Yes, just a minor dungeon run this time. Zoha said confidently. The other guard's gaze shifted to Sera. And who might this be? Zoha smiled and gestured towards Sera. This is an old friend of mine who has come to visit. She's quite interested in seeing Marwood for herself. The first guard chuckled. Must be quite the friend to get an endorsement from Lady Zoha herself. What's your name, miss? You can call me Sera. The guards exchanged a quick, knowing glance and grinned. One of them, a burly man with a crooked nose, stepped forward. That's a lovely name, and any friend of Lady Zoha's is welcome here, especially one as rare and enchanting as you. It's not often we see such elven beauty gracing our gates. His companion nodded in agreement. Indeed, it's a rare treat to see an elf in these parts. Perhaps we could show you around, make your stay more enjoyable. Zoha, sensing the guard's intentions and growing impatient, waved a hand dismissively. Your interest in my friend is noted. But we require rest, not your company. The guard's smirks faltered as they collectively sighed and stepped back. Of course, Lady Zoha. We meant no disrespect. Soon, the guards pushed open the wooden gates with a creak that echoed through the air. The gates parted, revealing the city of Marwood beyond. As Sera and Zoha walked in, she glanced at the demoness with a curious expression. Were they not supposed to check for any papers or anything of that sort? Zoha shrugged. The guards don't ask too many questions for A-rank adventurers such as myself. How come you are only an A-rank given your capabilities? I know you are capable of much more than what I saw. I didn't want to become too high profile. Many former S-rank adventurers get entangled in politics, something I prefer to avoid. Are there any other S-rank adventurers around? Not currently, they've all been persuaded to join the front lines. Sera chuckled. I see, that's good to hear. The two continued walking through the streets of Marwood. The buildings were run down, with many shops struggling to stay open. The air was thick with the smell of smoke and unwashed bodies, mingling with the occasional scent of cooked food from street vendors. Beggars lined the streets, their hollow eyes pleading for scraps of food or coins. Lines of weary people stood outside soup kitchens, waiting patiently for their turn to receive a meager meal. None of these people look like they would be missed if they were to disappear. All I need to do now is to figure out a way to get them into the dungeon. Chapter 9. A lesson learned. Sera and Zoha entered a market that was visibly less crowded than it must have been in better times. Most of the stalls stood abandoned, leaving behind empty tables and broken crates. A few persistent vendors still hawked their wares, but their voices lacked the energy and enthusiasm of thriving commerce. Until suddenly, Sera stopped as a sweet aroma drifted through the air. Her nose twitched, and she breathed in deeply. Zoha, where is that smell coming from? The demoness followed Sera's gaze and pointed to a stall near the edge of the market. I believe it's coming from over there. The stall in question stood out not only because of the aroma but also because it was the only one with a line of people queuing. The stall itself didn't look particularly impressive at first glance, built from rough-hewn wood that had seen better days. Behind the stall stood an old lady whose back slightly hunched with age. Her hands moved with surprising dexterity as she prepared a simple yet enticingly sweet dessert, a type of candied fruit wrapped in thin, golden brown dough. Zoha noticed Sera staring intently at the dessert stall for a while and spoke up. Do you want to go there and take a look, mistress? And no, that's not necessary, Sera said, quickly turning her head away to regain her composure. Zoha observed this unusual reaction, eyebrow arching in curiosity. Is it all right if I get a dessert for myself then? Sera straightened her posture. That's fine, I'll wait for you here. Yet, as Zoha moved towards the dessert stall, Sera's resolve wavered. It didn't take long before Sera found herself drifting after the demoness, almost as if an invisible thread was pulling her forward. Zoha chuckled softly at first when she noticed this. However, as Sera's gaze locked onto hers, the intensity in the Elder Dryad's eyes silenced her. When the two finally reached the front of the line, the old lady broke into a warm smile. Welcome. How many would you like to buy? I'd like just one, please, Zoha said. In that moment, the demoness felt something intense bore into her as she turned her head and noticed that Sera was glaring at her. She chuckled nervously before correcting herself. Actually, I'll take two. The old lady nodded as she started to prepare the desserts. She expertly rolled the dough around the candied fruit with a touch of finesse that spoke of years of experience. The dough turned golden brown in the wood-fired oven as a sweet, caramelized scent wafted through the air. Once perfectly baked, she carefully wrapped each dessert in a large green leaf. With a warm smile, she handed one to Sera and then another to Zoha. Feel free to pay whatever you can. Before Zoha could even finish paying the old lady, Sera had already brought the dessert to her lips. The texture was sublime, the candied fruit melding seamlessly with the soft, flaky dough. The dessert seemed to melt in her mouth, leaving a lingering taste that made her yearn for more. Astonished, Sera shot a surprised glance at the old lady. How do you make something so delicious? The old lady beamed with pride. It's an old family recipe, passed down through generations. I'm happy to be able to share it and help the community here. Out of curiosity, why do you allow your customers to pay whatever they like? I'm positive you could charge at least a few silver pieces for each of these. Zoha asked. The old lady's expression softened. I'm not actually from Marwood, just came back a few months ago to help out my family. But now, I'm staying a bit longer to sell desserts to the people here at below cost. It's my way of giving back. Sera nodded appreciatively. That's admirable. The old lady smiled, eyes crinkling at the corners. Thank you, dear. There are too many people being taken advantage of these days. I just want to do some good. What do you mean? There's been a rise in crime ever since the war started. Not to mention the charlatans posing as miracle healers. Sera leaned in closer. Tell me more about this, I'm curious. The old lady looked around cautiously before continuing. People are becoming very desperate. That's where these charlatans come in. They promise miracles and healing, but all they do is take advantage of those who have nothing left, stripping them of their last coins and leaving them worse off than before. The moment she finished speaking, the old lady sighed as her eyes drifted towards a sudden commotion nearby. A group of men were clanging pots together and shouting at the top of their lungs. Come, witness a miracle by the prophet of Zephyros, they yelled. The cacophony of sound and their fervent cries captured the curiosity of the market-goers as a crowd quickly gathered around the men. The old lady shook her head with a look of disdain on her face. Both of you better leave before you get caught up in all of that. Zohar reached into her pouch and selected a few gleaming gold coins. She placed them on the wooden counter and slid them towards the old lady. Thank you for the warning, Zoha said softly. Sera stood beside her, inclining her head in acknowledgement. And thank you for the dessert. The old lady's eyes widened in surprise, her gaze shifting from the coins to Zoha's face. You don't need to pay that much. The demoness smiled warmly as she met the old lady's gaze. I insist, she said gently, pressing the coins into the woman's hands. Consider it a token of our appreciation. The old lady hesitated for a moment, then nodded slowly. Thank you, and best of luck to you both. As they parted ways from the old lady, Sera and Zoha moved to a quiet corner, where they could finish their desserts. The Elder Dryad took another bite, savoring the sweet, rich flavor. You seem to be enjoying that quite a bit, mistress. Are you going to have a sudden change of heart and stop trying to feed humans to the spirit tree? Of course not. But I may decide to spare a few more people in the future, especially if they happen to be gifted in making these sweet treats. Sera's gaze shifted back to the group of men still clamoring for attention. However, the dessert maker's earlier remarks piqued my curiosity. We should investigate those so-called miracle workers and ascertain their true nature. Is there any reason why you are so curious about them, mistress? Seeing them gave me an idea, but enough talk for now. Soon, the two left their spot and followed a crowd in the distance moving further away. As Sera and Zohar rounded a corner, they saw that the people had gathered in a makeshift square. The noise here was different compared to the usual dreary mutterings they had heard so far, it was more focused, almost rhythmic. As Sera and Zohar approached, they noticed the crowd's attention was fixed on a man standing atop a large wooden box. His ragged robes hung loosely around his thin frame and he held a well-worn book as he chanted fervently. Come and gather around, people of Marwood. Come if you wish to see a miracle performed by a true servant of our Lord, Zephyros. Sera and Zoha pushed their way forward to get a better view. They caught sight of another man dressed in bright purple robes standing beside a cot. The bright color of his robes contrasted sharply with the drab surroundings, drawing all eyes to him. For years, this man has been unable to walk, the man in purple robes announced. He has lived in despair, confined to this very cot. But today, through the divine power of Zephyros, he shall be healed. Then, the purple-robed man placed a hand on the chest of the man lying on the cot. By Zephyros's name, you shall now walk again. The man on the cot stirred as he opened his eyes slowly. The muscles in his arms strained slightly as he pushed himself upright. He swung his legs over the side of the cot, the motion almost hesitant, as if testing the strength of his own limbs. But when he stood, Sera noticed how the man's movements were too controlled and strangely fluid for someone who had supposedly been immobile for so long. She caught the subtlety of his actions, noting the absence of the awkward, unsteady motions typical of those who had lost the use of their legs. Her senses extended, probing for any hint of magic, but detected none. An amateur performance, and somehow the crowd is falling for it. Thank you. Thank you, "Blessed servant of Zephyros," the healed man cried. The crowd erupted into cheers. Meanwhile, the man in ragged robes atop the box raised his arms high. "Believe in Zephyros, and your faith shall be rewarded." He gestured to several metal bowls placed in front of the prophet's feet. "If you wish to be blessed, now is the best time to show your devotion by sparing any coin you have. Even just 1 copper can give you a chance of being in Zephyros's eye." People pushed and shoved to throw coins into the metal bowls, eyes glinting with hope and desperation. Hands trembled as they released their grip on the copper coins, the small pieces of tumbling into quickly overflowing bowls. Sera grimaced in disgust. "Fascinating." She and Zoha moved away from the crowd, their steps brisk and purposeful. The cacophony of clinking coins and fervent prayers gradually faded as they distanced themselves from the makeshift pulpit. Sera dusted off her cloak, then glanced at Zoha with a look of mild curiosity. "Have the people of Marwood always been this desperate?" Zoha shrugged, briefly glancing back at the crowd that was now dispersing. "It's hard to say for sure, mistress. But the war certainly wouldn't have helped things. I understand where the masses are coming from. Despair is a powerful thing, and any semblance of hope can make a significant difference," Sera said. Zoha's eyebrows rose in surprise. "I expected you to be disgusted by what we saw. While I do harbor disdain for humans, it would be foolish to let that blind me to the reality of their situation. Hatred by itself does very little. So, what do you plan to do with this understanding?" "I propose we put what we saw into practice, for the benefit of the spirit tree." Zoha tilted her head. "You want to put on a show, like the false prophet?" "Indeed, I plan to heal the masses and pretend to be a prophetess of some kind. All I need you to do is help me gain attention and manage the crowd." "That's doable, mistress." But suddenly, Sera paused as she drifted into contemplation. She let out a measured breath, fingers tracing part of her cloak. Slowly, she pressed her lips into a thin line before she spoke, and spoke with a softer voice than usual. "Zoha, I must apologize for not accounting for this earlier. But is healing magic common in the current era?" The demoness' eyebrows shot up in surprise. "As far as I know, mistress, you're the only person who can use any form of healing magic. That certainly simplifies things. Now, we just need a place to start," Sera said. "The slums aren't too far from here, I'm sure we will have no shortage of eyes there." "Good, we should head there immediately. And while we're walking, listen carefully to my instructions." The demoness led Sera through towards the slums. Gradually, the air grew thick with the smell of refuse and unwashed bodies, and the ground beneath their feet became a patchwork of muddy paths and broken cobblestones. Makeshift shanties and dilapidated structures leaned precariously against one another, walls patched with whatever materials could be scavenged. Children with dirt-streaked faces darted between the shadows while adults huddled in small groups. Sera's eyes scanned the surroundings until they fell upon a man in tattered rags sitting against a wall. She turned to Zoha, her voice a low murmur. "Go and get the people's attention. We need an audience for this." Zoha nodded as she moved towards the people nearby, her unorthodox appearance alone commanding their attention. She approached small groups and attempted to speak with them. At first, they were apprehensive and some tried to shoo the demoness away. But Zoha's words held a certain magnetism, drawing them in despite their initial reluctance. The more she spoke, the more heads turned towards Sera. The emerging audience barely reached a dozen people, but it was enough for a start. Meanwhile, Sera approached the man who looked at her warily. "What do you want?" Sera offered a gentle smile. "I am a servant of the goddess Sera, and I am here to help you." The man's eyes narrowed. "Spare me the bullshit, heard all of that one too many times before. I ask for no payment. I only wish to restore your arm. Why should I believe you? No one does anything for free. The goddess compels her followers to act charitably without expecting compensation in return. What's the harm in giving me a chance?" The man hesitated, then finally nodded. "Fine. But if this is a trick..." "It is no trick," Sera said. She knelt beside the man and placed her hand gently over the bandaged stump of his arm. Green light emanated from her palm, growing brighter as it enveloped the stump. A small crowd formed as they watched the light intensifying. The man gasped as he watched his arm regenerate rapidly. Bone reformed first, the structure knitting together with an almost audible click. Muscle fibers followed, weaving over the bone layer by layer. Finally, skin grew over the newly formed arm and smoothed it out seamlessly until the limb was fully restored. The man stared at his new limb in awe as he flexed his fingers. Soon, the crowd erupted into a chorus of gasps and murmurs. Zoha stepped forward to seize the moment. Anyone who is sick or injured, come forward. For a true prophetess of the goddess Sera is here. More people gathered around Sera almost immediately. A woman approached cautiously as she cradled a child with a high fever. The child's skin was flushed and damp with sweat, his breathing shallow and rapid. Sera knelt beside them and gently placed a hand on the child's forehead. Again, green light emanated from her palm, and the child's fever broke within seconds. The mother wept with gratitude, hugging her child close. Over the next few hours, Sera healed burns, mended broken bones, and cured illnesses that had plagued these people for years. Each act of healing drew gasps of awe and murmurs of gratitude as the crowd grew larger and larger. Eventually, the sun was close to setting on the slums. Sera stood up as she figured that she's done enough healing for the day. Unfortunately, I must rest for the night. I will return tomorrow for those who still need me. The people clamored around her with pleas and gratitude. Hands reached out to touch the hem of her cloak, as if her very fabric held the promise of salvation. Others called her name in the hopes that she would notice. Zoha stepped between Sera and the crowd to carve a path through the throng as she made her voice clear. Make way for the prophetess, she will return soon. The crowd parted reluctantly, their eyes never leaving Sera as she moved through them. She met their gazes with a gentle smile, feigning acknowledgement of their need as she navigated the sea of outstretched hands. After leaving the slums, Sera and Zoha entered a more well-off district of Marwood. The streets here were cleaner, the cobblestones neatly arranged and free from the grime that marred the poorer areas. Buildings stood taller and prouder, while shop fronts displayed a variety of goods, from fine silks to gleaming jewelry. The two made their way to an inn, a 3-story building with a slate roof and walls of pale stone. A wrought iron sign swung gently in the breeze, bearing the name The Silver Stag in elegant script. Inside, the reception area featured a large stone fireplace. Plush armchairs and small tables were arranged around the hearth, offering a comfortable place for guests to relax. The floors were polished hardwood while a crystal chandelier hung from the ceiling. The receptionist, a young woman with auburn hair tied back in a neat bun, looked up as they entered. Welcome back, Lady Zoha. Zoha offered a cordial smile in return and approached the desk. Can I get an additional room for my friend here? The receptionist nodded, flipping through a leather-bound ledger. Of course, we have a lovely room available on the second floor with a view of the garden. Will that be suitable for you both? Zoha glanced at Sera, who gave a slight nod. Yes, that will do nicely. The receptionist smiled and handed Zoha a brass key. Room 207. I'll have some fresh linens and a tray of refreshments sent up right away. If there's anything else you need, please don't hesitate to ask. As they made their way up the polished wooden staircase, Sera couldn't help but notice the subtle luxury that permeated the inn. The walls were covered with tapestries depicting scenes of hunting and feasting, and the soft carpet underfoot muffled their steps. Soon, they reached the second floor, where Zoha led Sera to her room. She unlocked the door and pushed it open to reveal a cozy, well-appointed space. The bed was covered in a plush quilt, and a small writing desk stood in one corner. Zoha stood near the doorway. She glanced back at Sera, her hands clasped lightly in front of her. Is there anything else you need from me, mistress? Sera raised a hand. Stay for a bit. We need to discuss our plans. Zoha nodded and moved to pull over a chair. She positioned it across from Sera, who seated herself on the edge of the bed, feeling the plush quilt give slightly beneath her weight. She tapped a finger thoughtfully on the bed, creating small indentations in the soft fabric. This is a slightly random question, but do you actually need sleep, Zoha? The demoness shook her head. No, though I can enter a sleep-like state if needed. Good, then it's time to discuss our next step forward. Is this about those humans in the slums you healed? Absolutely, and to be frank, I'm not sure if my idea is sustainable in the long term. Why do you say that, mistress? The humans looked more than eager to flock to you. I have no doubt in my mind that at least a few of them would be willing to follow you back to the dungeon. The issue is that I am also accumulating notoriety. While this is acceptable in the short term, I believe that after gathering an initial following of humans, it would be prudent to abandon this prophetess guise and seek an alternative strategy. But isn't notoriety advantageous for you, mistress? You can leverage your fame to draw more humans into the dungeon. While that is true, fame can quickly spiral out of control. My immediate objective is to expedite the growth of the spirit tree, but it must be done in a controlled manner. If that's the case, why don't we establish a secretive cult, mistress? That way, we can attract followers discreetly and maintain a low profile. That is not a terrible idea, but a cult has far less reach than a more mainstream faith. Moreover, you are already aware that I do not wish to attract the kind of attention that a larger, more public following would bring. Zoha tilted her head, her hair cascading over her shoulder as she regarded Sera with curiosity. If you're not going to start a cult, then what is your plan? Sera leaned back slightly, her fingers still idly tapping the plush quilt. Tomorrow, I plan to gather as many people as I can who are willing to follow me and lead them to the dungeon. Zoha nodded thoughtfully, her eyes narrowing slightly. But why mention doing things tomorrow? Do you need sleep? Sera gave a small smile. It seems that Zoha is still searching for some kind of weakness she can exploit. My current guess is that she will try to find a way out of the contract if I give her the chance. This could prove to be another opportunity. I don't need sleep, but I do need to enter a rest-like state for at least 8 hours a day. Sera lied, her voice betraying no sign of deceit. Zoha's brow furrowed in concern. Is there any way I can help? Sera shifted her position, crossing her legs on the bed. Just lock the room, Zoha. Ensure no one disturbs me while I rest. Zoha moved to the door and locked it before glancing back at Sera. Out of curiosity, what is your resting state like, mistress? Feigning a casual demeanor, Sera shrugged. I won't be conscious of anything unless I'm in direct danger. It's a deep, meditative state. I'll keep watch, mistress. You can rest easy. Thank you, Zoha. Sera pretended to close her eyes. She kept her breathing slow and steady, counting each inhale and exhale to maintain the facade. A full minute passed, and she felt the subtle shift in the air as she sensed that Zoha had moved. Slowly, Sera opened her eyes, the dim light of the room sharpening into focus. The space around Sera was quiet, but a quick glance confirmed that the demoness had disappeared. Although the door to her room was still closed. With this, I can finally show Zoha the difference in our power. Allowing her this bit of freedom is a calculated risk, but necessary. She must see that even in her attempts to assert control, she is always within the confines of my will. She walked up to the window and pressed a hand on the cool glass. Now, to wait for the inevitable. Chapter 10 Desperation. Abila, capital of Lizaria. A cloud of flies manifested in an alleyway, swirling and parting to reveal Zoha's lithe form. She emerged from the shadows as she stepped onto a well-maintained cobblestone road. She left the alleyway and stepped onto a bustling street filled with wealthy human nobles and merchants. Not few of them were accompanied by beastkin servants, their subservient demeanor contrasting starkly against the opulence of their masters. But none of these people were of interest to her for now. The place where she would seek her salvation was up ahead, a large and imposing structure that dominated the street. The entrance to the concert hall was flanked by imposing marble columns adorned with carvings of musical notes and instruments. Lyres, flutes, and harps intertwined with flowing ribbons of music, their forms so lifelike they looked almost ready to spring to life. Even from outside, Zoha could hear the sound of people cheering and clapping. Zoha approached the entrance of the concert hall as fast as she could. She had to wade through a large crowd of humans and beastkin as she slipped between the gaps, occasionally having to push aside those who blocked her path. As she neared the entrance, a guard stepped forward with a hand outstretched. Halt, the show has already. But as his eyes settled on her face, recognition dawned. My apologies, Lady Zoha, he corrected himself, bowing slightly in deference. How can I assist you this evening? Zoha offered him a charming smile. Would you be so kind as to let me inside? I don't mind, Lady Zoha. However, I must inform you that there are no available seats in the concert hall. Sir Dante is performing tonight, and the venue is at full capacity. Zoha almost rolled her eyes at the pompous title Sir Dante. But she quickly swept her emotions aside and composed her features into an expression of serene charm. I'm sure you can make an exception for me, can't you? It's certainly not impossible, but there are no more seats available in the hall. Zoha reached into her purse and discreetly slipped a few gold coins into the guard's hand. I don't mind standing, surely you can just let me inside. The guard's hesitation melted away at the sight of the coins. He nodded eagerly and pocketed the money with a smile. Of course, right this way. He led her through the grand entrance, the noise of the crowd growing louder with each step. As they entered the main foyer, Zoha's senses were immediately assaulted by the rich scents of perfume and the mingling voices of the city's elite. She was led through throngs of elegantly dressed patrons. Laughter bubbled up here and there, mingling with the clink of champagne glasses. All while the light of chandeliers bathed everything in a warm light. As they entered the auditorium, the atmosphere shifted to one of sheer jubilation. Rows of plush seats stretched out before her, each one occupied by an enraptured guest. The audience's faces were filled with anticipation and joy, eyes fixed on the stage at the far end of the hall. On that raised stage stood the so-called Sir Dante, dressed in a finely tailored black suit. His blonde hair caught the light with each movement, and his blue eyes sparkled with confidence as he played his violin effortlessly. The crowd was utterly captivated, their eyes fixed on Dante as he played. The sight of the crowd's complete adoration towards him grated on her nerves, but she knew that she had to keep herself composed, at least for now. The demoness moved to a dark corner where the dim light barely reached, her presence almost merging with the shadows. She stood still with her eyes fixed on the stage as she waited for Dante's performance to conclude. Unlike the rest of the audience, she neither clapped nor shed a tear throughout the entire show. Approximately 15 minutes later, the final note of Dante's performance lingered in the air. He lowered his bow with a graceful, controlled motion. The silence that followed was profound, a moment of collective anticipation that filled the hall. Then, the spell was broken by a wave of thunderous applause as the audience rose to their feet, clapping and cheering with fervor. Amidst the standing ovation, the demoness remained still in her shadowed corner, her gaze never wavering from the stage. Dante acknowledged the crowd with a gracious bow. "Thank you, thank you. I deeply appreciate your enthusiasm and support. However, I must express a desire for more active participation in cheering and applause in the future." His gaze lingered pointedly on Zoha as he spoke, causing several people to look at her with curious and judgmental looks. Zoha's gaze hardened as she glared back at the onlookers. They quickly averted their eyes, intimidated by her fierce expression. Dante's eyes twinkled with mischief as he caught Zoha's reaction, and he sent a playful wink her way. Zoha cringed involuntarily. What an unfortunate day to come to him for help. With the performance concluded, Dante addressed the audience once more. "Thank you for being a wonderful audience. I look forward to seeing you all again soon." He was then escorted backstage and disappeared behind the grand curtains. Meanwhile, Zoha waited patiently as the crowd gradually thinned out. When the time was right, she slipped through a side door. The hallways wound like a labyrinth, but Zoha navigated them with practiced ease. It was far from her first time in the concert hall, and she made use of several lesser-known doors and entrances that the opulent nobles and merchants would never think of going through. Soon, she located the backstage door, its worn wooden surface partially concealed in the dim lighting of the hallway. Standing before it was a lone guard. "Halt," he commanded. "This area is restricted to guests." Zoha squared her shoulders, eyes narrowing as she locked onto the guard's gaze. "I need to get through. This is important." The guard shook his head. "My apologies, Lady Zoha, I can't let you inside. Orders are orders." Frustration bubbled up within the demoness, her fingers curling into fists at her sides. Just as she prepared to argue, the doors behind the guard swung open with a soft creak as Dante made himself known. "Is there a problem here?" The guard turned, his expression shifting to one of immediate apology. "Sir Dante, I didn't realize." "Let her in," Dante said, waving a hand dismissively. "She is my guest." The guard stepped aside and Zoha brushed past him, eyes locking with Dante's in a brief, intense exchange. Dante turned and led her down a narrow corridor, the walls lined with framed posters of his past performances. Each poster served to display his illustrious career, showcasing him in various dramatic poses with his violin. Awards and trophies gleamed from glass cases set into the walls. Almost all of them were won only within the last year. As they reached the end of the corridor, Dante opened the door to a private room, which was filled with posters of him plastered across every wall. The sheer volume of self-aggrandizement was almost suffocating to the demoness. Her attention was drawn to a trophy resting on a nearby shelf. She picked it up and read the inscription, "Most talented new performer." Zoha shook her head, her expression hardening with disdain. "I didn't think you'd take playing the violin this seriously, brother." Dante moved to a leather couch and sat down. He reached for a crystal decanter on a nearby table and poured himself a glass of wine. The deep red liquid swirled in the glass. He then took a slow, deliberate sip. "What can I say? I'm just that good." Zoha crossed her arms, leaning back against the closed door. Hard to believe you're still doing these performances. I thought playing the violin was just a hobby. It was, until I became really good at it. Then I decided being a performer wasn't so bad. Perhaps I shouldn't have expected anything else coming from you. Dante's eyes twinkled with amusement as he set the glass down. It's such a shame that my dear sister isn't capable of understanding the merits of music. The demoness pushed off from the door and started to wander around the room, then paused as she noticed an ornate deer mask perched on a stand. It was carved from polished wood, smooth to the touch. The mask featured large, expressive eye holes and it was crowned with small, decorative antlers that curved from the top. She picked it up, turning it over in her hands. And what's this for? Dante glanced at the mask. I tried my hand at theatre a few months back. Thought it might be interesting to explore a different facet of performance. Ultimately, it went against my natural flow. Too scripted, not enough room for improvisation. Everything about you is unnatural. I know what I want, and I'm happy. Isn't that what matters? Zoha studied the mask for a moment longer before looking up at Dante. Would you be annoyed if I took this? Slightly. Dante said nonchalantly. Without hesitation, Zoha tucked the mask into her cloak. It's mine now. Dante shook his head and sighed. All right, what's going on? You finally come to see me for who knows how long and the first thing you do is try to piss me off. Zoha hesitated, her usual confidence faltering. She glanced around the room, avoiding Dante's eyes. I do need your help. Dante's eyebrows shot up in genuine surprise. By the dead gods, what happened to you? Zoha sat down on the couch next to him. I've been bound to an atrocious contract. You won't believe the terms. That bad? It's basically a slave contract. I never had a chance to negotiate better terms. She had me cornered. Who could possibly enforce a contract like that on you? My new mistress is an Elder Dryad. The room fell silent, the weight of her words hanging heavily in the air. Dante's eyes widened in disbelief. Are you certain? Zoha's frustration bubbled to the surface. Do you think I'd be here if I could solve this on my own? Are you going to help me or not? Dante stood up abruptly and walked over to a large, ornate cabinet in the corner of the room. He pulled open the heavy wooden doors and retrieved a thick book bound in black leather. Zoha's eyes followed his movements with deep curiosity. What is that? Dante placed the book on the table between them, its cover adorned with intricate silver designs. I bought this from an adventurer a long time ago. Not sure who the author is, but it appears to be some kind of old encyclopedia which happens to have information on Elder Dryads. Zoha raised an eyebrow. That's awfully convenient. Since when did you start reading? Dante met her gaze with an earnest expression. I've been reading for a long time, trying to find a way for us to go back home. Zoha's irritation flared, the corners of her mouth tightening. Just open the damn book. Dante sighed but complied and sifted through the pages of the encyclopedia, its pages yellowed and grainy. Until he finally stopped at a section labeled Elder Dryads. He coughed into his hand before reading out loud. Elder Dryads are ancient and powerful beings with immense control over nature magic. Should you happen to encounter one, it is advisable to flee immediately on sight. Does the book have any information that isn't already obvious? Zoha scoffed. It's not easy to find useful info in a book this dense, Dante muttered, flipping through a few more pages without much enthusiasm. Zoha huffed, crossing her arms. Well, keep looking. We need something useful. I am looking, he snapped back. But it's not like there's an index specifically for your exact situation. Zoha's impatience grew. Just try harder. Dante grumbled under his breath but continued sifting through the pages. After what felt like an eternity of turning yellowed pages, something caught his eye in the footnotes. Hold on, there's a reference here to another part of the book. Page 237. Zoha leaned in. Well, go on then. Check it out. Dante flipped to the indicated page, his eyes scanning the text quickly. His expression changed as he began to read, a mix of surprise and realization dawning on his face. This section talks about the sources of an Elder Dryad's power. It mentions that their strength is often tied to something specific, like a sacred tree or a unique location. Zoha leaned closer, her eyes wide with anticipation. Keep reading. What else does it say? It says that disrupting this connection can weaken or even sever their bond entirely, Dante said. If we can find and sever this connection, there's a chance that the contract could become weak enough for you to break free. Zoha shook her head and sighed. That's going to be impossible. Dante sighed, rubbing his temples. I thought so. But what if we try tampering with the contract directly? Can you actually do that? I can try, but it's risky. You'll have to trust me. Zoha looked conflicted initially. She bit her lip, tension evident in her posture. But after a long moment of contemplation, she exhaled sharply and met Dante's gaze. I'm willing to try. Dante gave a small, reassuring smile. All right, let's get started. I'll need a dagger. Zoha reached into her cloak and grabbed her dagger, extending it towards Dante. He accepted the dagger and glanced at Zoha's arm, the demoness skin still obscured by layers of bandages. He slowly unwound the cloth, revealing the insectal exoskeleton beneath. Then, he paused for a moment, the edge of the dagger poised at an opening in the carapace. The blade hovered, a fraction of an inch from her skin. Slight warning, this might hurt. Zoha nodded, bracing herself. Just do it. Dante carefully made a small incision, the blade slicing through the tough exterior. Zoha winced as a trickle of purple blood oozed from the wound. Afterwards, he grabbed a glass vial from a nearby cabinet and collected the blood inside. He placed the vial on the table and retrieved a few other items from his cabinet, a small tome, a piece of parchment, and a quill. He opened the tome and chanted softly, resonating with the arcane energy in the room. While he was chanting, Dante dipped the quill into Zoha's blood and started to write on the parchment. Intricate symbols and runes appeared, glowing with a pulsating light. Dante concentrated deeply as he carefully inscribed each rune with careful precision. All Zoha could do was watch, her fingers gripping the edge of the table so hard she made dents in the wood. But suddenly, a sharp pain shot through Zoha's body. She gasped, clutching her sides as the agony intensified, radiating from her core outward like wildfire. It hurts. What's happening? Dante continued scribbling frantically. Shit, hold on. I'm almost done. Yet, the pain only grew more excruciating. Zoha's vision blurred, legs giving way as she collapsed to the floor. Her body writhed in torment, every muscle seizing in unbearable agony. It hurts. Dante dropped the quill and rushed to Zoha's side. I'm so sorry. What? How? You need to return to your mistress, she's the only one who can stop this. Oh, okay. Zoha gasped, tears streaming down her face. Summoning the last of her strength, Zoha gave a weak nod. And in an instant, her form dissolved into a cloud of flies that vanished as soon as they appeared.